I remember it like it was yesterday, even though more than a decade has passed since that summer. I was 22, freshly graduated from college, feeling invincible and in hindsight utterly naive. I'd landed a temporary gig assisting Dr. Eris Thorne, a somewhat eccentric but brilliant historian, on an archaeological survey of a forgotten village named Oak Haven. It wasn't exactly what I'd pictured for my first foray into the professional world, but the pay was good, and the promise of escaping city life for a few months was alluring. Oak Haven was less a village and more a ghost town, swallowed by the wilds of upstate New York. It had been abandoned sometime in the early 20th century after a series of unexplained disappearances, or so the local legends went. Dr. Thorne was fascinated by the place, convinced it held clues to a unique regional dialect that had died out. Me. I was mostly excited about the quiet and the chance to use my dusty anthropology degree in the field, even if it was just cataloging rusted tools and crumbling foundations. Our base camp was a small rented cabin about 3 miles outside Oak Haven itself. Dr. Thorne preferred to drive in each morning and leave before dusk, but I, being young and eager, often stayed later. The village was remote, nestled deep in a valley where cell service was non-existent. The nearest gas station was an hour's drive, and the closest neighbor was a deer. It was isolation in its purest form, and initially I found it incredibly peaceful. The only significant structure still standing with any integrity was the old church, and right next to it, the clock tower. Its wooden frame was gray and warped, missing most of its face, a skeleton against the bruised evening sky. It hadn't chimed in probably 70 years, maybe more, or so I thought. My vulnerability that week wasn't a mistake so much as an oversight. Dr. Thorne had to attend a conference, leaving me alone at the site for 5 days. He'd prepped me, of course, gone over the maps, double-checked the supplies. Just catalog the ceramics from Quadrant Elio, he'd said, his glasses perched on his nose. And don't stray too far from the main path. The woods can get disorienting. He'd smiled then, a harmless, avuncular warning. I'd shrugged it off. Disorienting, I had a GPS, a compass, and a healthy dose of youthful confidence. The first few days alone were uneventful. I worked in the quiet, the only sounds the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a hawk, and the rhythmic scratch of my pencil against my notebook. The evenings were long, filled with reading by lantern light and the overwhelming silence that pressed in from every direction. It was on the third night, a Thursday, when things began to subtly shift. I'd worked late, losing track of time as I meticulously cleaned fragments of pottery. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples, fading fast into twilight. I was packing up my tools, the air growing cooler, when I heard it. A faint metallic groan, followed by a deeper, resonant thunk. I froze, hand hovering over my backpack. The sound had come from the direction of the old church, from the clock tower. It was barely audible, swallowed almost immediately by the gathering dusk, but it was there. It sounded like something heavy moving, or perhaps attempting to move. I stood in the growing gloom, my heart giving a small, unexpected lurch. The air had suddenly turned colder, prickling the back of my neck. I told myself it was just the old wood settling, or maybe a gust of wind. But then, a few seconds later, there was another, almost imperceptible clink. Just a single, soft clink, like a small gear finally catching, or perhaps a forgotten mechanism stirring to life after decades of silence. I stood there, a shadow among the deeper shadows, my breath held tight in my chest. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, a thick blanket woven with the whispers of the dying light. My rational mind, ever the well-trained academic, immediately began to construct explanations. Wind, of course. An old structure like that, it was bound to creak and groan. Maybe a loose timber shifted. Or an animal, perhaps a raccoon, had found its way inside, knocking something over. A gear, a forgotten piece of the ancient mechanism, dislodged by time and gravity. Yes, that had to be it. But even as I cycled through these sensible possibilities, a cold, needle-thin tendril of unease unspooled in my gut. The air hadn't just turned cooler, it felt different, charged with an almost imperceptible hum like static electricity before a storm. The clink had been too precise, too distinct to be dismissed as mere happenstance. It hadn't sounded like something falling, it sounded like something engaging. My eyes, now largely accustomed to the gloom, flickered towards the clock tower, its skeletal silhouette a stark cutout against the bruised canvas of the sky. It seemed to loom larger, more menacing than it had just minutes before. The missing face of the clock was a gaping, eyeless socket, staring out into the twilight, and I felt an irrational urge to avert my gaze. I forced myself to breathe, a slow, deliberate intake of the cool, damp air. My heart was still thudding an erratic rhythm against my ribs. Get a grip, Leo, I chided myself. It's an old building. Buildings make noises. Still, the meticulous cataloging I'd been so engrossed in moments ago now felt trivial, utterly irrelevant. My backpack suddenly seemed to possess an urgent gravity, pulling me towards it. I gathered my tools with a newfound urgency, the rhythmic click of metal on metal sounding jarringly loud in the oppressive quiet. My fingers, usually steady, fumbled slightly with the clasps. I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, scanning the deepening shadows, half expecting to see some explanation materialize, some obvious source for the disquiet. But there was nothing, only the swaying branches of the ancient trees, their leaves rustling like dry whispers. The walk back to the cabin, usually a peaceful winding down of the day, transformed into an exercise in heightened paranoia. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the undergrowth became a potential threat. My flashlight beam, usually a comforting pool of light, now seemed to shrink the world around me, creating more darkness than it dispelled. The beam danced nervously over gnarled roots that looked like grasping fingers, and the dense foliage that pressed in on either side of the narrow path felt like a suffocating shroud. I walked faster, my footsteps crunching loudly on the dry leaves, each sound amplifying the silence that followed. I kept my gaze fixed ahead, but every fiber of my being was aware of the dark woods to my left and right, and more disturbingly, the silent presence of the clock tower behind me, an unseen sentinel watching my retreat. When I finally reached the small, rented cabin, its solitary lantern glow seemed like a beacon of sanity in a world that had suddenly decided to tilt off its axis. I slammed the door shut, the solid thunk echoing satisfyingly, and then threw the deadbolt, an act that felt both foolishly theatrical and profoundly necessary. I leaned against the door for a moment, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my shoulders slumping with a tension I hadn't recognized until it began to dissipate. The cabin was small, rustic, and familiar. My books were stacked neatly on a rickety table, my camp stove sat quietly in the corner, and the air smelled faintly of pine and old wood. It was a comforting human space. But even here, the unnerving experience lingered. I felt a prickling awareness at the back of my neck, a sense of something watching. I told myself it was just my imagination, overstimulated by the isolation and the unexpected sounds. I tried to resume my evening routine. I prepared a simple meal, ate it quickly, and then attempted to read. But the words on the page blurred. My mind kept replaying the faint metallic sounds, groan, thunk, clink. The clink was the one that truly disturbed me. It was too precise, too deliberate. The silence in the cabin, usually so welcome, now felt oppressive, amplifying every creak of the old wood, every distant hoot of an owl. I kept glancing towards the window, half expecting to see something peering back from the darkness. The window was a black mirror reflecting my own uneasy face, superimposed with the faint outline of the trees outside. Sleep was a long time coming. I lay in my cot, bundled in my sleeping bag, listening to the symphony of the night, crickets, cicadas, the whisper of wind through the pines. But beneath it all, I strained to hear something else, something unnatural. My mind, still running on adrenaline, conjured images of the clock tower, its ancient gears slowly, inexorably grinding into motion. It was foolish, of course. Mechanical things don't just spring to life after 70 years of disuse without a human hand to prompt them, do they? I must have drifted off eventually, though it felt more like a brief, restless surrender than actual sleep. I woke with a jolt, heart hammering, to the absolute conviction that something was wrong. My eyes snapped open, piercing the inky blackness of the cabin. For a moment, I couldn't place the feeling, only the raw, primal certainty of alarm. Then I heard it. A sound so utterly unexpected, so fundamentally impossible, that my mind initially refused to process it. It was faint, barely audible over the rush of blood in my ears, but it was there, undeniably. Dong! A single, deep, resonant chime. It wasn't a soft, metallic clink this time. It was the full, sonorous strike of a bell, a clock bell. My breath hitched, my body went rigid, every muscle tensed. It had come from the direction of Oak Haven, from the clock tower. Dong! Another chime, this one slightly clearer. A low, throbbing vibration that seemed to penetrate the very floorboards of the cabin, the very air itself. I scrambled upright in my cot, my sleeping bag tangling around my legs. My flashlight lay on the small table beside me, and my hand shot out, fumbling for it in the dark. My fingers closed around the cool metal, and I pressed the switch. The beam cut through the darkness, a shaky, nervous finger pointing at nothing. Dong! A third chime, stronger now, carrying with it a strange, mournful quality. It was slow, deliberate, each strike separated by several seconds of agonizing silence. What time was it? I fumbled for my phone, but then remembered it was useless out here. My watch glowed faintly in the dark, 3:17 a.m. Dong! My mind was a whirlwind of frantic thoughts. This was impossible. The clock hadn't chimed in decades. Dr. Thorne had explicitly mentioned it. Everyone knew it was defunct, yet here it was, tolling in the dead of night. 4 chimes. The sound wasn't just physical, it felt like a presence, a heavy, unseen weight settling over the valley. It wasn't the sound of an old mechanism failing, it was the sound of something working, something awakening. I sat there wide awake, bathed in the anemic glow of my flashlight for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the next chime, waiting for something else entirely. The chimes stopped at 4 in the morning, not midnight, not noon, just 4. My terror was quickly replaced by a burgeoning sense of profound, almost dizzying curiosity. What on earth was happening? Had someone else come to the village? Dr. Thorne hadn't mentioned any other researchers, and the place was supposedly forgotten. Was it some local prank? But who would bother way out here? And how would they even get the ancient mechanism to work? The remaining hours until dawn were a blur of restless anxiety. I didn't sleep again. I sat up, clutching my flashlight, straining my ears for any repeat of the impossible chimes. The silence that followed the four strikes was almost as unsettling as the chimes themselves. It was an expectant silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. When the first hint of gray light appeared in the eastern sky, painting the cabin walls with a faint, ethereal glow, I practically sprang out of bed. I felt a desperate need to confront whatever had caused those sounds. My earlier fear of the dark woods now paled in comparison to the burning questions raging in my mind. I dressed quickly, throwing on my field clothes. I grabbed my camera, my compass, my GPS, and my notebook. I even hesitated over a small, sturdy trowel, considering it as a makeshift weapon, but ultimately decided against it. This wasn't a fight, this was an investigation. An archaeological mystery far stranger than any I'd anticipated. The walk back to Oak Haven in the pre-dawn light was different from the night before. The trees still felt ancient and watchful, but the light, however faint, offered a measure of reassurance. The morning air was crisp and cold, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and decaying leaves. I moved with a nervous energy, my senses on high alert. As I approached the village, the familiar sight of the crumbling foundations and skeletal structures should have been comforting, but instead they seemed imbued with a new, unsettling quality. The clock tower, when it came into view, stood exactly as I had left it, a gaunt, weathered structure next to the old church. There was no smoke, no sign of human activity, no obvious explanation. It looked utterly inert, a monument to forgotten time. I approached the church cautiously, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud on the packed earth. The church itself was a simple wooden structure, its roof partially caved in, its windows long since shattered, leaving dark, empty eyesores, but my attention was fixed on the clock tower. It was attached to the church by a small enclosed passage, a common design in old New England architecture. The main door to the church was missing, replaced by a gaping maw of darkness. The door to the clock tower, however, was a heavy, reinforced wooden one set into the side of the tower itself, facing away from the church entrance. It looked formidable, secured by a rusty iron latch and an enormous, ancient padlock, thick with verdigris. I stopped about 20 feet away, my heart thumping. I scanned the ground around the tower, looking for footprints, disturbed earth, anything that would indicate someone had been here. Nothing. The dry leaves and scattered pine needles looked undisturbed, a pristine blanket over the soil. I took a deep breath and moved closer, my eyes darting over every surface. The wooden planks of the tower were gray and weathered, patched in places where time had eaten away at the wood. High above, where the clock face should have been, was only a large, empty square opening, exposing the dark interior. And at the very top, beneath the small spire, I could see the outlines of the bell itself, silhouetted against the brightening sky. It was there, unmistakably. A large, dark mass of metal. I reached the clock tower door. The padlock was still in place, heavy and rusted shut. There was no way anyone could have opened it without some serious tools, and there were no signs of forced entry. This only deepened the mystery. If no one had entered, how had the clock chimed? I ran my hand over the weathered wood of the door, feeling the rough grain beneath my fingertips. It felt solid, unyielding. I pressed my ear against it, listening. Nothing. Only the faint creak of the church structure settling and the distant call of a bird. Frustrated, I backed away, surveying the entire structure again. The walls looked sound, no obvious breaches. I walked around the perimeter of the tower, checking for any hidden entrances or weak spots. I noticed a small, high window on the side facing the church, covered with a rusted wire mesh. It was too small to climb through, even if the mesh wasn't there. My gaze returned to the padlock. It was an antique, clearly original to the tower. It hadn't been touched in decades. There was no sign of a keyhole being picked, no pry marks. It was as if the sounds had come from within the sealed tower without any external interference. This was beyond strange. This was something supernatural, or something so utterly improbable that my scientific mind recoiled from the implications. I was a rationalist and anthropologist. My work dealt with tangible evidence, observable phenomena. Ghosts and spontaneously chiming clocks were not in my curriculum. I spent the next hour examining the clock tower from every conceivable angle, taking photos, making sketches, meticulously documenting everything. I even took samples of the moss growing on the padlock, hoping that some microscopic analysis back in civilization might offer a clue, though I knew it was a long shot. I ran my hands over the wooden frame, testing its stability, searching for any loose panels, any hidden access points. There was nothing. It was a sealed, silent tomb. Finally, defeated but no less curious, I turned my attention to the church. Maybe, just maybe, there was an interior passage from the church to the tower that I hadn't noticed. The church, after all, was mostly open to the elements. I stepped through the gaping doorway of the church, my boots kicking up dust from the ancient floorboards. The air inside was cold and stagnant, thick with the scent of decay and damp earth. Sunlight filtered weakly through the gaps in the roof and the empty window frames, casting long, distorted shadows across the nave. Pews were overturned, their wood rotting. The altar was a crumbling mess of stone and plaster. It was a testament to time's indifference, a place of worship now worshiping only entropy. I made my way carefully through the debris, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light like tiny, frantic spirits. I reached the front of the church, near where the altar would have been. To my left, I found a small, heavily splintered wooden door, almost entirely obscured by fallen timbers and rotted cloth that might once have been an altar cloth. It was clearly an internal door, leading to a smaller room or, hopefully, the tower itself. I carefully moved the debris, wincing as a section of dry-rotted wood splintered under my touch. The door was old, its paint long gone, but unlike the main clock-tower door, this one wasn't padlocked. It was simply stuck, swollen with years of damp and disuse. I put my shoulder to it, grunting with effort. With a protesting groan of ancient wood and a shower of dust, it finally gave way, swinging inward with a screech that echoed eerily through the empty church. Beyond the door lay a narrow, dark antechamber leading to a set of steep wooden stairs. A faint, earthy smell, different from the general decay of the church, emanated from the darkness. It was a smell of old, confined spaces, of stagnant air and forgotten things. This had to be it, the internal access to the clock tower. My heart began to pound with a renewed sense of anticipation and apprehension. This was it, the source of the sounds, the explanation, or perhaps the deeper mystery. I flicked on my flashlight and cautiously stepped into the antechamber. The air immediately grew colder, heavier. The stairs were narrow and worn, each step groaning under my weight. Cobwebs, thick and heavy, clung to the walls, shimmering like ghostly curtains in the beam of my light. The wood of the handrail felt slimy and cold beneath my fingers. I ascended slowly, my senses on high alert. With each step, the air grew colder, and a faint, metallic scent, almost like rust mixed with something else I couldn't quite place, grew stronger. The stairs spiraled upwards, turning sharply, obscuring what lay ahead. Finally, after what felt like an interminable climb, I reached a small landing. Directly in front of me was another door, this one made of heavy, dark wood, reinforced with iron bands. It had a large, ornate iron handle, but no visible lock. It looked incredibly solid, like a vault door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the cold metal of the handle. My mind raced through possibilities. What if it wasn't just old machinery? What if someone was in there, a squatter, a madman, or something far stranger? The unexplained disappearances from the village's history suddenly felt less like local legend and more like a warning. I pushed down the handle. It moved with a stiff, grating sound, but surprisingly, it turned. I pushed the door inward, bracing myself. It opened into a cavernous, dusty space, the very heart of the clock tower. The air was thick with ancient dust motes dancing in the weak light filtering down from the bell chamber above and through the empty clock face opening. The metallic scent was overwhelming here, mixed with the unmistakable aroma of old, well-oiled machinery, oddly preserved despite the decades. Before me stood the clockworks. It was an enormous, intricate mechanism, a marvel of antiquated engineering. Gears, large and small, made of polished brass and dark iron, were arranged in a complex dance of levers, springs, and weights. Cables, thick as my wrist, snaked down from the ceiling, disappearing into the floor. The whole assembly stood almost 15 feet tall, gleaming faintly in the dim light, a silent, intricate beast. My archaeologist's heart leaped. This was incredible. A perfectly preserved, enormous antique clock mechanism, but it was also unnerving. It looked almost ready, as if it could spring to life at any moment. I stepped further into the chamber, my flashlight beam sweeping across the machinery. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust, but beneath it I could see the glint of metal, the careful craftsmanship. This was a piece of history, an engineering masterpiece. And then I saw it, or rather them. In a small, relatively clear section of the floor, directly beneath the largest brass gear, were two distinct, unmistakable depressions in the thick layer of dust. Footprints. Human footprints. They were recent, too recent to be from decades ago. The edges were still sharp, not blurred by settling dust. They led from the base of the winding mechanism towards a small, dark corner of the tower, then back again, and they were large, larger than my own. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone. Someone had been in here. Someone had accessed this mechanism. But how? The exterior door was padlocked and the internal door had been stuck for decades. And why, and more importantly, where were they now? I followed the direction of the footprints, my flashlight beam trembling slightly. They ended at a shadowy recess in the stone wall, partially obscured by a dangling chain that was part of the clock's winding system. I moved closer, my hand reaching for the chain, pushing it aside. Behind it, the recess wasn't just a hollow. It was a crudely carved opening, almost like a small, hidden passageway, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It descended into utter blackness. The air that wafted out of it was even colder than the towers, carrying that same metallic, earthy scent, but now tinged with something else, a faint, almost imperceptible mustiness that prickled at my nose. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat. This was unexpected. This was new. A hidden passage leading down, presumably beneath the tower, perhaps even beneath the church. The old legends of unexplained disappearances echoed in my mind. What if this passage was connected to them? I knelt, peering into the inky blackness. The footprints definitely led into it. The thought of venturing into that dark, unknown space sent a shiver of pure dread down my spine. But my curiosity, now supercharged by the undeniable evidence of recent human presence and the impossible chiming, was a powerful force. I had to know, I absolutely had to know what lay down there. I carefully pulled out my phone, still no service, of course, and took several photos of the footprints and the hidden opening. I documented everything in my notebook, my hands shaking slightly. I considered leaving, going back to the cabin, and waiting for Dr. Thorne, but the thought of not knowing, of those 4 chimes echoing unanswered, was unbearable. Besides, Thorne wouldn't be back for days. I was alone out here. Whatever this was, I had stumbled upon it, and it felt like it was now my responsibility to uncover it. I took a deep, fortifying breath. Anthropologists explore, I told myself, trying to sound brave even to myself. They uncover hidden histories. This was a hidden history, all right. I shone my flashlight down the passage. It appeared to be a narrow, rough-hewn tunnel descending at a shallow angle. The walls looked like natural earth and rock, not brick or carefully cut stone, suggesting it might be much older than the clock tower itself, perhaps even predating Oak Haven. I hesitated for another long moment, wrestling with my fear. The darkness seemed to beckon, but also to threaten. I thought of the village's grim past, the warnings of the disorienting woods, and a sudden, sharp clarity pierced through the haze of my adrenaline. This was no ordinary archaeological site. But the chimes, the impossible chimes, they were a challenge, a riddle that demanded an answer, and the footprints were an invitation. I grabbed my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and tightened the straps. I checked my flashlight one last time, making sure the batteries were strong. I took another deep breath, steeling myself. Then slowly, carefully, I began to lower myself into the hidden passage, inching forward, flashlight beam cutting a nervous path into the unknown depths below. The cold air rushed up to meet me, carrying the distinct scent of damp earth, something metallic, and something else, something faintly organic, like old, dry leaves, but deeper, more ancient. Each step into the encroaching darkness felt like a step further away from the rational world, a descent into a mystery that promised to be far more profound and perhaps far more dangerous than I could possibly imagine. The rough walls pressed in on either side, and the ceiling was so low that I had to hunch over, making my progress slow and awkward. The sounds of the world above, the rustling leaves, the distant bird calls, faded with each meter I descended, replaced by a profound, echoing silence, broken only by the scuff of my boots and the frantic beat of my own heart. The tunnel twisted and turned, never following a straight path for more than a few feet. It felt less like a carefully constructed passage and more like a naturally occurring fissure that had been widened, or perhaps a burrow. The air grew progressively heavier and the temperature dropped even further. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, even through my thick jacket. The musty, organic scent intensified, a cloying presence that made the back of my throat itch. It was the smell of long undisturbed earth, but also something else, something faintly acrid, like old, dry blood or something mineral that had oxidized over centuries. I kept my flashlight beam steady, sweeping it across the rough walls and ceiling, searching for any signs, any clues. The walls were uneven, composed of a mixture of compacted earth and exposed rock strata, glistening with faint traces of moisture in places. There were no carvings, no markings, no obvious human additions beyond the initial excavation, which itself seemed ancient. Whoever had made this passage or widened it had done so a very, very long time ago. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, the tunnel began to level out. The ceiling remained low, forcing me to stay hunched, but the ground beneath my feet became flatter. The air, while still cold and damp, felt less oppressive. And then I saw a faint glow ahead. My breath caught in my throat, a light, a source of light in this subterranean darkness. It wasn't a natural light, it had a soft, yellowish hue like a lantern or an oil lamp. It was too steady to be a flashlight. Caution warring with an almost uncontrollable urge to discover, I extinguished my own flashlight, plunging myself into near-total darkness, relying on the distant glow. I moved forward with exaggerated slowness, placing each footstep with meticulous care, trying to make absolutely no sound. My ears strained, trying to pick up any sound beyond my own ragged breathing and the thumping of my heart, but there was nothing, only the heavy, pregnant silence of the earth. As I drew closer, the passage widened slightly, opening into a larger space. I pressed myself against the rough wall, peering around the bend. I found myself looking into a large, circular chamber entirely underground. The walls here were also of rough-hewn earth and rock, but they seemed to have been smoothed and packed down in places, suggesting deliberate shaping. In the center of the chamber, casting that soft, amber glow, sat a single, crude lamp, fueled by what looked like animal fat, its wick flickering faintly. The chamber wasn't empty. There were figures. Not human figures, not exactly. They were huddled around what looked like a rough stone altar or table in the center of the chamber, illuminated by the lamp. There were 3 of them, and they were unlike anything I had ever seen. Their forms were humanoid, but elongated, unnaturally thin. Their limbs were spindly, their bodies draped in rough, dark garments that seemed to be woven from some coarse, fibrous material. Their skin, where it was visible on their long, gaunt hands and necks, was pale, almost translucent, with a sickly, yellowish cast like ancient parchment. But it was their heads that truly arrested me, freezing me in place, every rational thought fleeing my mind. They were not human. Their heads were elongated, almost conical, tapering to a point at the top. Their faces were smooth, devoid of any discernible nose or ears, only faint indentations where they should have been. And their eyes were large, entirely black like polished obsidian, reflecting the lamp's light with an unsettling, depthless intensity. They seemed too large for their skulls, dominating their features. They were silent, utterly, unnervingly silent. They weren't speaking, weren't moving much, just hunched over the altar. My anthropologist's mind, despite the shock, tried to categorize, to understand. Undiscovered primate species, an elaborate hoax, some kind of deformed humans, but none of the categories fit. They were too alien, too utterly other. What were they doing? I strained my eyes, trying to see what lay on the altar. It looked like an array of objects, gleaming faintly in the lamp's soft light. Fragments of metal, polished stones, small, intricately carved bone pieces. They seemed to be arranging them, their long, pale fingers moving with a deliberate, almost ritualistic slowness. My blood ran cold as I watched them, utterly fascinated and terrified. These were the something behind Oakhaven's dark legends. These were the reason for the disappearances. But what were they, and what did they want? I tried to keep my breathing shallow, my body pressed tightly against the rough stone wall, praying they wouldn't notice me. The air in the chamber felt thick with an unknown energy, a palpable sense of ancient purpose. Suddenly, one of the figures, the tallest of the 3, raised its head. Its long, pointed skull slowly turned, its black, depthless eyes sweeping across the chamber. For a horrifying moment, I thought it had seen me, that those empty eyes were looking directly into my hiding place. My heart leaped into my throat, hammering so loudly I was sure it would give me away. But its gaze didn't linger on my spot. Instead, it slowly traversed the ceiling, then focused intently on a section of the rough-hewn rock above the altar. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it raised one of its spindly arms, pointing a long, pale finger towards a particular spot on the ceiling. And then a sound. It wasn't a human voice. It wasn't a language I recognized. It was a low, resonant hum, a guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from deep within its chest, filling the chamber with a strange, reverberating tone. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a moan, but something in between, a sound of profound antiquity and unsettling power. The other two figures immediately ceased their meticulous work. They looked up at the first figure, then followed its gaze to the ceiling. A second figure let out a similar low hum, a slightly higher pitch, harmonizing with the first in a way that was both discordant and strangely melodic. It was a sound that seemed to speak of immense age and alien intelligence. My mind reeled. They were communicating. They had a language, or at least a form of vocalization. And they were clearly intelligent, capable of performing complex tasks and rituals. As they focused on the ceiling, their heads tilted slightly, I noticed something else in the chamber. On the floor near the altar were several shallow depressions, almost like beds or resting places, lined with the same coarse, dark fabric as their garments. And scattered around were other objects, rough earthenware bowls, bone tools, and pieces of what looked like dried, unfamiliar vegetation. This was their home, their hidden, subterranean sanctuary. And they were not alone in it. My flashlight beam, which I had extinguished earlier, had slipped from my grasp at some point during my frantic descent into the passage. It lay on the floor behind me, a few feet into the tunnel, a small, dark cylinder against the rough earth. I must have dropped it when I was too focused on being quiet. And now, as I watched the three figures, mesmerized and terrified, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible scuffling sound coming from the tunnel behind me. My blood ran cold for the second time. I hadn't come alone. Something else was in the passage, and it was moving. A new fear, more immediate and pressing than the alien creatures before me, seized me. What if it wasn't an animal? What if it was another one of them, coming up behind me, trapping me in the narrow passage between two sets of unimaginable horrors? The scuffling sound grew slightly louder, closer. I could hear the faint scraping of rough fabric against earth, a soft, almost slithering movement. Whatever it was moving with a quiet, deliberate stealth. My eyes darted from the figures in the chamber, still engrossed in their strange observation of the ceiling, to the darkness of the passage behind me. I was caught, trapped. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat that threatened to burst through my chest. The ancient, musty air suddenly felt impossibly heavy, suffocating me. I felt a cold dread, deeper and more profound than anything I had ever experienced, crawl up my spine. I had blundered into something ancient, something secret, and I was utterly, completely alone. My hand instinctively reached for the small trowel I had brought, but it was still in my backpack, which was awkwardly slung over my shoulder. Even if I could reach it, what good would a small archaeological tool be against whatever these things were? The sound behind me was now unmistakable. It wasn't a scuffle. It was a soft, guttural breathing, ragged and uneven, emanating from the darkness just a few feet away. And then a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air, a sense of a presence drawing closer, too close. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. My eyes, wide and terrified, were fixed on the three elongated figures in the chamber, praying they wouldn't notice my predicament. My muscles screamed in protest, but I held myself utterly still, a terrified statue carved from flesh and bone. A low, soft hiss came from directly behind me, so close that I felt the faint brush of cold air against the back of my neck. Then a sudden blinding flash of light exploded in the passage. My own flashlight. It had been kicked or somehow activated, pointing directly into the chamber, directly at the three alien figures. The low hums from the figures in the chamber immediately ceased. All three of their elongated heads snapped towards the source of the light, their large, black eyes instantly locking onto me. They had seen me. I was exposed. My cover was blown. For a moment, a terrifying, drawn-out moment, there was absolute silence. The flickering lamp in the chamber cast long, dancing shadows, highlighting the alien features of the creatures. Their black eyes, now fixed on me, seemed to bore into my very soul, utterly devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient, terrifying intelligence. Then the creature behind me moved. I didn't see it, but I felt a sudden, sharp push against my back, sending me stumbling forward out of the narrow passage and into the center of the circular chamber. I fell awkwardly, landing hard on my hands and knees on the rough earth floor, my backpack skidding off my shoulder. My head snapped up. The three figures were no longer huddled over the altar. They were standing, tall and unnervingly thin, their black eyes unblinking, fixed on me. And from the mouth of the passage, emerging slowly from the darkness, was a fourth figure, identical in its terrifying appearance, its long, spindly arms still extended as if it had just pushed me. I scrambled backwards on the floor, my eyes darting from one creature to another, fear a cold, paralyzing grip on my sanity loosening. I scrambled backwards, pressing myself against the rough, cold earth, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the four terrifying figures. My breath hitched in my throat, a dry, useless gasp. My backpack lay awkwardly beside me, its contents spilling slightly onto the dirt. The flashlight, still bright, lay where it had fallen in the passage, creating a stark, almost theatrical beam that illuminated the scene. The four beings watched me, utterly still. Their large black eyes, like pools of ancient night, reflected the flickering light of the crude lamp and the sharp glare of my dropped flashlight. There was no discernible expression on their smooth, featureless faces, no hint of anger or curiosity or fear, only an unnerving, profound stillness. They were not just silent, they were quiet, as if their very presence absorbed sound. My mind, despite the overwhelming terror, desperately tried to make sense of what I was seeing. My anthropological training, a lifetime of logical thought, clashed violently with the impossible reality before me. These creatures defied every known classification. They were not human, not ape, not any terrestrial animal I had ever studied. They were something else entirely. The one who had pushed me, the fourth figure, now stood fully in the chamber, its gaunt form adding to the unsettling tableau. It was slightly taller than the others, its conical head reaching higher towards the low ceiling. Its spindly arm, still outstretched from the push, slowly retracted, its fingers long and bony, tipped with faint, almost translucent nails. A long, agonizing moment stretched between us, thick with unspoken dread. The only sound was the frantic pounding of my own heart in my ears, a deafening drumbeat against the profound silence of the chamber. The air, already cold and thick with the smell of damp earth and something acrid, felt charged with an unseen energy, a palpable weight that pressed down on me. Then the tallest figure, the one that had first raised its head and hummed, took a step forward. Its movement was slow, deliberate, almost balletic, despite its unnatural thinness. Its bare, elongated feet, pale and nearly translucent, made no sound on the rough earth floor. It moved with an eerie grace that was deeply unsettling. It stopped about 10 feet from me, its black eyes unwavering. It tilted its head slightly, an almost imperceptible movement as if considering me. I braced myself, every muscle tensed, expecting an attack, a shriek, anything. But there was nothing, only that silent, unwavering gaze. Then one of its long, spindly arms slowly, almost majestically, lifted. Its finger, impossibly long and pale, pointed not at me but past me, towards the mouth of the tunnel I had just stumbled out of. And then it lowered its arm, its head tilted slightly further, as if indicating something. It made that low, guttural humming sound again, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from its very bones, filling the chamber with a strange, reverberating tone. It wasn't hostile, not overtly. It was more like an inquiry or perhaps a command. The other three figures responded with their own low hums, a chorus of alien sounds that wove together, creating a complex, unsettling melody. It was a sound that seemed to resonate with the ancient rock walls, a voice from forgotten depths. My mind, still reeling, tried to interpret. Were they telling me to go back, or were they commenting on my origin, on where I came from? The sheer alienness of their communication was paralyzing. Suddenly, the fourth creature, the one behind me, moved. It bent down towards my dropped flashlight, its elongated fingers closing around the metal casing. It picked it up, its movement precise and unhurried. For a horrifying moment, I thought it would use it as a weapon or crush it. Instead, it slowly, deliberately turned the beam away from the chamber, pointing it back into the tunnel, then placed it carefully on the ground, still pointing inward. It then moved to my backpack, its pale fingers gently exploring the rough fabric. It didn't open it, didn't rummage through it, just seemed to examine its texture and shape. This was not what I expected. There was no aggression, no immediate violence, only a strange, almost methodical curiosity. The tallest figure hummed again, a slightly different cadence this time. The other two, previously silent, now turned their attention back to the stone altar in the center of the chamber. Their long fingers, precise and careful, resumed their work, arranging the gleaming metal fragments, polished stones, and carved bone pieces. It was a clear signal. I was not to be immediately harmed, but I was also not dismissed. I was being observed, assessed, and they were continuing their work. I slowly, cautiously pushed myself up from the floor, my eyes never leaving them. My muscles screamed in protest, stiff from the cold and tension. I tried to stand tall, to project some semblance of authority or calm, but my legs felt like jelly. As I stood, the tallest figure's black eyes swept over me once more, lingering on my face for a moment before returning to the group on the altar. It was a clear dismissal, a gesture that told me I was no longer the primary focus. They had resumed their ritual. I looked around the chamber, trying to find an escape route, a way out of this impossible situation. But there was nothing. The passage I had come through was narrow, and the creature that had pushed me was now standing near its mouth, not blocking it entirely, but certainly acting as a silent sentinel. The walls of the circular chamber were solid rock. There was nowhere to go. I was trapped in an ancient subterranean chamber with 4 alien beings performing some unknown ritual. My gaze drifted to the altar. The crude lamp flickered, casting a warm, deceptive light over the objects they were meticulously arranging. I could see them more clearly now. There were indeed fragments of what looked like polished brass and dark iron, some intricately shaped, others seemingly random shards. Alongside them were smooth, dark stones unlike any I recognized, some with faint, luminous veins running through them. And the bone pieces, they were small, carved with incredibly fine, almost microscopic etchings, forming patterns that seemed both mathematical and organic. My anthropological curiosity, despite the paralyzing fear, began to assert itself. This was a culture, a hidden, ancient civilization. These were artifacts. What did they mean? I took a tentative step towards the altar, drawn by an irresistible urge to understand. The tallest figure, without turning its head, let out a low, warning hum. I froze, my foot halfway lifted. The message was clear: observe, but do not interfere. So I stood there, utterly still, a silent spectator to an alien ritual, fear and fascination warring within me. I watched them work, their movements precise, their long fingers almost dancing over the altar. They were arranging the pieces in a specific pattern, moving them, then pausing, studying the configuration, then subtly shifting them again. It was like watching master craftsmen assemble an impossibly complex puzzle, or ancient priests performing a sacred rite. As they worked, I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible pulsation coming from the arrangement on the altar. A soft, internal glow, emanating from the luminous veins in the stones, grew and faded with a slow, rhythmic beat like a hidden heart. And with each pulsation, I felt a subtle thrumming in the very air of the chamber, a low-frequency vibration that resonated deep within my chest. My eyes widened. This wasn't just ritual, this was activation. They were doing something, something was happening. I remembered the clock in the tower above, the impossible chimes. 4 of them at 3:17 a.m. Could this be connected? Were these artifacts part of a larger mechanism, a control system? I risked another small step forward, then another, inching closer to the altar, my eyes fixed on the pulsating arrangement. The tallest figure still hadn't turned its head, but its low hum became slightly more pronounced. A subtle warning. I stopped about 15 feet away, close enough to discern more detail. The largest of the brass fragments was shaped like a crescent moon, its edges incredibly sharp and polished. It was placed at the center of the arrangement, surrounded by 8 of the dark, luminous stones arranged in a perfect circle. The bone carvings were placed meticulously between the stones, each one facing a specific direction. And then I saw it. One of the smaller brass fragments, intricately shaped like a tiny, stylized gear, was placed directly in the center of the crescent moon. As I watched, one of the creatures, the smallest of the 3 at the altar, reached out with a long finger and with infinitesimal care rotated the tiny gear a fraction of an inch. The pulsation from the altar intensified. The luminous veins in the stones flared brighter, and the low thrumming in the air grew stronger, becoming a palpable vibration that made the earth under my feet tremble faintly. And then from far above, a sound. Dong! My breath hitched. It was the clock in the tower, a single deep resonant chime. My eyes snapped upwards towards the ceiling of the chamber, as if I could see through the layers of rock and earth to the mechanism above. One chime, just one, and it had followed the manipulation of the altar. The connection was undeniable. This altar, this ritual, these creatures, they were directly controlling the ancient clock tower. But why and how? What was the purpose of a clock that only chimed when manipulated from a hidden underground chamber by alien beings? The creatures at the altar paused their work, their heads tilted, listening to the reverberations of the chime. Their black eyes, still devoid of emotion, seemed to hold a flicker of something. Satisfaction, completion, it was impossible to tell. Then the smallest creature, its task seemingly complete, retracted its finger from the tiny gear. The pulsation from the altar slowly began to subside, the light from the stones dimming, the thrumming in the air fading back to a faint, barely perceptible vibration. The tallest figure turned its head fully towards me, its black eyes locking onto mine once more. This time its gaze was different. It wasn't just observation, it was a profound, almost invasive scrutiny. I felt as if it were seeing into my very thoughts, peeling back the layers of my consciousness. It was a terrifying, deeply unsettling sensation, like a cold hand reaching into my mind. Then slowly, almost ponderously, it raised its long, spindly arm again. Its finger, still impossibly long, now pointed directly at my chest, then arced slowly towards my head. It made that low, guttural hum again, but this time it was singular, directed at me. It was a sound that seemed to demand attention, to convey a message beyond simple vocalization. My brain, overwhelmed, struggled to process. Was it identifying me? Was it asking something? Was it recognizing something about me? The sheer enigma of it was maddening. Suddenly, without warning, the creature behind me, the sentinel at the passage mouth, moved. It took a single, swift step, its elongated form blurring slightly, and was suddenly right beside me. Its hand, cold and surprisingly strong, clamped onto my upper arm. Its grip wasn't painful, but it was firm, unyielding. I flinched, startled, my heart leaping into my throat. Its black eyes, at close range, were even more unnerving, reflecting my terrified face like polished mirrors. I could feel the faint tremor of its body, a subtle vibration that seemed to match the fading thrum from the altar. It didn't speak, didn't hum, it simply turned me around, its grip still firm, and began to propel me gently but insistently back towards the passage mouth. The message was clear. My time as a silent observer was over. I was being dismissed. I resisted for a split second, my instinct to understand overriding my fear. I tried to pull away, to turn back towards the altar, to demand answers. But its grip tightened, and a low, almost imperceptible pressure radiated from its hand, a silent warning that promised greater force if I continued to struggle. I stopped resisting, my mind racing. This wasn't an escape attempt. This was an escorted departure. They weren't letting me stay, but they weren't harming me either, not yet. The creature guided me to the entrance of the passage, its tall, gaunt form pressing slightly behind me. It released my arm and then, with another gentle push on my back, directed me into the dark, narrow tunnel. My discarded flashlight, still pointing inward, provided the only illumination. I stumbled back into the cramped confines of the passage, hunching over once more. The cold, damp air enveloped me. I glanced over my shoulder, but the creature had already retreated, melting back into the shadows near the chamber entrance. The three figures at the altar had resumed their work, seemingly undisturbed, their low hums starting up again, a faint echo in the receding distance. As I moved deeper into the passage, retrieving my flashlight with a fumbling hand, the sounds of their ritual faded. The light from the crude lamp grew fainter, finally disappearing as the tunnel twisted. I was alone again in the absolute darkness of the earth, with only my trembling flashlight beam to guide me. The ascent felt longer, colder, and far more terrifying than the descent. Every creak of the earth, every rustle of an unseen insect sent shivers down my spine. My mind was a whirlwind of impossible images, the elongated figures, their black eyes, the pulsating altar, the single chime of the clock. It was too much. My rational mind screamed in protest, rejecting the reality of what I had just witnessed. But the cold, physical memory of the creature's grip on my arm, the metallic scent in the air, the thrumming in my chest, it was all too real. When I finally emerged from the hidden passage back into the clock tower chamber, the pre-dawn light filtering through the empty clock face opening seemed shockingly bright, almost painful. I gasped for breath, sucking in the cool, relatively fresh air, trying to clear the metallic, musty scent from my lungs. The clockworks, enormous and intricate, stood silently before me, gleaming faintly. It looked utterly inert, just as it had before. But I knew better now. I knew its secrets, or at least I had witnessed a piece of them. My first impulse was to run back to the cabin, pack my things, and drive as far away from Oakhaven as humanly possible. To forget everything I had seen, to pretend it was all a dream, a hallucination brought on by isolation and stress. But then the other instinct asserted itself, the anthropologist's drive for understanding, the insatiable curiosity that had led me down into that terrifying darkness. I couldn't run, not yet. I had stumbled upon something monumental, something that challenged every preconceived notion of history, of humanity, of reality itself. I carefully moved the debris from the internal door, closing it softly behind me. I didn't bother trying to re-stick it, I just wanted to leave it as undisturbed as possible. I navigated the crumbling church, stepping out into the faint morning light. The village, normally a picture of forgotten tranquility, now seemed to pulse with a hidden, ancient life. I walked numbly back towards the main clock tower door, the heavy, reinforced wooden one with the enormous, ancient padlock. I stopped before it, staring at the thick verdigris, the rusty iron. It was still sealed, just as I had found it, unbroken, untouched. And yet the clock had chimed, and I had been inside. The external padlock was merely a deception, a facade. The real access was hidden deep beneath the earth. I knew I needed to document everything, every detail. My camera was still in my backpack, my notebook and pen. This wasn't just a story, it was a discovery. A terrifying, world-altering discovery. But first, I needed to process. I needed to think. I needed to be somewhere safe, somewhere I could breathe without the oppressive weight of the earth and the memory of those black, depthless eyes. I practically ran the 3 miles back to my cabin, driven by a desperate need for the familiar. The woods, which had seemed menacing the night before, now felt like a desperate blur of green, a tunnel to safety. I didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't listen for anything. My only goal was the cabin, its solitary lantern glow, its promise of 4 walls and a deadbolt. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me, the solid thunk this time a frantic plea for protection. I threw the deadbolt, then stood leaning against the door, gasping for air, my entire body trembling uncontrollably. The cabin was still and silent, a stark contrast to the primal chaos of my mind. The morning light was now fully illuminating the room, stripping away the shadows, but it did little to dispel the terror that clung to me like a shroud. I stumbled to the small, rickety table, collapsing onto the chair. My hands were shaking so violently I couldn't hold them steady. I tried to pour myself a glass of water, but the cup rattled against the pitcher, spilling water over the table. My mind raced, replaying every horrifying detail. The hums, the alien forms, the ritual, the altar, the single chime, it was all real, incontrovertibly real. I grabbed my notebook, my hands still trembling, and forced myself to pick up a pen. I had to write it down, everything, before my mind, in a desperate act of self-preservation, tried to erase it, to rationalize it away. I wrote frantically, scribbling down every observation, every sensation, every terrifying detail. The elongated bodies, the conical heads, the obsidian eyes, the lack of nose or ears, the translucent skin, the spindly limbs, the rough garments, the crude lamp, the pulsating altar, the metal, stones, and bone carvings, the low, resonant hums, the creature's grip, the insistent push back into the tunnel, and the single, solitary chime of the clock. As I wrote, the sheer weight of the implications began to settle on me. These creatures, they were living, breathing, intelligent beings. They were ancient, and they were hidden right beneath Oakhaven, influencing the village's very existence, perhaps even its demise. The disappearances. What if they weren't disappearances at all, but rather acquisitions or sacrifices? My stomach churned. I looked down at my notes, my hastily scrawled words seeming inadequate, almost childish in the face of such a monumental discovery. This wasn't an archaeological find, it was first contact, and I was hopelessly unprepared. Dr. Thorne, he had to know, he was a historian, a scholar. He would understand the gravity of this. He would know what to do, but he wouldn't be back for days. Days, I was still alone. The isolation, which had initially been so peaceful, now felt like a suffocating trap. No cell service. An hour's drive to the nearest gas station. 3 miles of dark, watchful woods between me and the village and the unimaginable horrors it contained. I tried to think logically. What was their purpose? Why the clock? If they were living underground, what did they eat? How did they sustain themselves? What was the significance of the ritual on the altar? Was it a power source, a communication device? My eyes fell on my geology textbook, still open on the table. Rock strata. The tunnel had been rough-hewn, natural earth and rock. It had looked ancient, much older than the clock tower. Had these beings been here for centuries, millennia, hiding in the earth, observing, perhaps even subtly influencing the world above? A chilling thought struck me. What if they had known I was there all along? What if my presence in the clock tower, my frantic search for an explanation for the first sounds, had been anticipated? The way they had reacted, not with immediate aggression, but with observation and a controlled dismissal, suggested a calculated intelligence, a profound understanding of their surroundings. They hadn't acted out of panic, they had acted with purpose. This wasn't just a hidden civilization, it was a deeply secretive one that had maintained its anonymity for an unimaginable stretch of time, and I had just blown their cover. The more I thought, the more questions piled up, each one heavier and more disturbing than the last. My initial fear began to transform into something else, a cold, hard knot of determination. I was scared, yes, utterly terrified, but I was also an anthropologist. This was a unique opportunity, a chance to unravel a mystery that could rewrite history. I couldn't just run and hide. I looked at my notes again, then at the scattered contents of my backpack. My camera, my GPS, my compass, all the tools of my trade. They felt ridiculously inadequate, like bringing a toy shovel to dig up a mountain, but they were all I had. I needed more information. I needed to understand their patterns, their motivations. I needed to find a way to communicate, or at least to observe them without being detected. And I needed to do it before Dr. Thorne returned, before anyone else stumbled upon this impossible truth. The rest of that day was a blur of hyper-alert anxiety. I couldn't bring myself to work on the ceramics. I couldn't even sit still for long. I paced the small cabin, glancing out the window at the familiar woods, now imbued with a sinister watchfulness. Every creak of the old wood, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept expecting to see one of those gaunt figures peering in, its black eyes unblinking. I forced myself to eat, but the food tasted like ash. I tried to read, but the words blurred, my mind replaying the alien hums, the pulsating altar. As evening approached, a new wave of terror washed over me. Nightfall, the time when the barrier between the known and unknown seemed to thin, the time when the clock had chimed. I double-checked the deadbolt, then added my heaviest trunk against the door, a futile gesture against what I now knew lay in the earth. I draped blankets over the windows, trying to create a complete blackout, as if darkness could hide me from something that lived in perpetual darkness. Sleep was impossible. I sat on my cot, fully dressed, my flashlight clutched in my hand, my ears straining against the night symphony of crickets and cicadas. I listened for the hums, for any sound from the direction of Oakhaven, but the night was silent, unnervingly silent. Hours crawled by, each minute an eternity. My imagination conjured grotesque images of the creatures, their spindly limbs scuttling through the earth beneath me, their black eyes watching from unseen crevices. I felt a profound sense of isolation, a terrifying realization that I was utterly alone in facing this. Then at precisely 3:17 a.m. it happened again. Dong! My body went rigid. Dong! My breath hitched in my throat. Dong! The low, resonant chimes vibrated through the very floorboards of the cabin, through my bones, shaking the air around me. Dong! 4 chimes, just like the night before. But this time it was different. This time I knew what was causing them, and I knew how. The chimes ceased, leaving behind an echoing silence that felt heavier, more pregnant with meaning than before. They weren't a random occurrence. They were a deliberate act, a continuation of their ritual, controlled from deep beneath the earth. I knew then that I couldn't wait for Dr. Thorne. This wasn't just about documenting a discovery anymore. This was about understanding an ancient, hidden intelligence, an intelligence that seemed to be marking time. 4 chimes exactly at 3:17 a.m. every night. Why? What did it signify? The fear was still there, a cold, persistent tremor in my gut. But beneath it, a new feeling was emerging, a desperate, burning need to know. The anthropologist in me, the seeker of hidden truths, was fully awake, eclipsing the terrified student. When the first sliver of dawn painted the eastern sky, I was already up, preparing. My fear of the unknown still warred with my curiosity, but curiosity was slowly winning. I was going back. I had to. I packed my bag with more care this time. My camera, a fresh notebook, extra batteries for the flashlight. I even slipped a small, sharp utility knife into my pocket, a purely psychological comfort against the impossible. I reviewed my notes from the previous day, trying to organize my thoughts to formulate a plan. I needed to observe without being seen. I needed to understand the chimes, their pattern, their meaning. And I needed to learn more about these creatures, their purpose, their connection to Oak Haven. The walk back to the village felt different. The woods were no longer a mere obstacle. They were a vast, living labyrinth, concealing profound secrets. The air was crisp, the morning sun casting long, eerie shadows. The crumbling foundations of Oak Haven now seemed less like ruins and more like the skeletal remains of a stage, a backdrop for an ancient, ongoing drama. As I approached the church and the clock tower, my heart began to pound with a familiar mixture of dread and exhilaration. The gaunt structure stood silent, seemingly inert, but I knew better. I knew the life that pulsed beneath it. I didn't go directly to the clock tower this time. I needed to be cautious. I needed to establish a perimeter, a way to observe without being detected. I decided to approach the church from a different angle, using the cover of some overgrown bushes and the dense canopy of trees. I moved slowly, deliberately, my senses heightened. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call was scrutinized. I found a cluster of ancient hemlocks about 50 yards from the church, their branches providing excellent cover. From there, I had a decent view of the church's gaping doorway and the side of the clock tower where the internal passage was located. I settled down, pulling out my binoculars, my camera, and my notebook. My plan was simple: observe and document, see if they emerged, see if anything else happened, see if the internal door showed any signs of activity. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, casting dappled light through the leaves. The village remained silent, seemingly lifeless. No figures emerged from the church. No sounds came from the clock tower. Only the constant hum of the forest, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I watched the internal door to the clock tower, the one I had left slightly ajar. It remained still, undisturbed. It was as if my entire terrifying encounter had been a dream, a figment of my overactive imagination. But the chimes, the 4 deep, resonant chimes at 3:17 a.m., they were undeniably real. Late morning gave way to early afternoon. My patience was wearing thin, but I forced myself to remain still, to continue my vigil. I ate a power bar, drank some water, my eyes constantly scanning the church and tower. Then, just as the sun began its slow descent towards the western horizon, painting the sky with the first hints of afternoon gold, I saw it. A faint shimmer, a distortion in the air right at the gaping doorway of the church. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like heat haze rising from the ground, but there was no heat and the air was still. It lasted only a moment, then vanished. My heart leaped. I raised my binoculars, focusing on the spot. Nothing, just the empty doorway, the crumbling stone, the shadows deepening within. I waited, my breath held tight. Had I imagined it? My eyes were strained from hours of staring. Then the shimmer reappeared. This time it was more distinct, a rippling distortion, as if the very air itself were briefly liquefying. And through it, almost transparent, I thought I saw a faint, elongated shape, a shadow within a shadow, barely visible. It was one of them. It was emerging from the church, not through the internal door, but through the main, open entrance. But it wasn't walking like a normal being. It was almost phasing, appearing as a momentary distortion, then solidifying, then fading slightly, like a ripple in the fabric of reality. My fingers tightened around my binoculars. My mind raced, struggling to comprehend. This was a new ability, a terrifying new piece of the puzzle. They weren't just hidden, they could obscure themselves. They could move through the world unseen, perhaps even unnoticed. The elongated figure solidified completely for a brief moment, standing in the archway of the church. Its black eyes, even from this distance, seemed to gleam with an unsettling intensity. It scanned the clearing, its conical head slowly turning, taking in its surroundings. I held my breath, pressing myself deeper into the hemlocks, praying my camouflage was sufficient. Had it seen me? Was it looking for me? Its gaze swept over my hiding place, then continued, moving towards the woods on the opposite side of the clearing. It lingered there for a moment, then with that same subtle shimmer, it began to move. Not walking, not running, but a strange, gliding motion, almost like it was being pulled by an invisible string. And with each movement, its form subtly distorted, fading and reappearing, making it incredibly difficult to track. It was heading into the woods towards the west, away from the path to my cabin. What was it doing? Was it hunting, exploring, or was it performing some other part of its unknown ritual? A desperate thought sparked in my mind. This was my chance to get back into the clock tower, to gather more information without immediate detection. They were not all underground. One of them was out. The risk was immense. What if it returned early? What if there were others still down there, guarding the chamber? But the urge to understand, to uncover more, was overwhelming. I watched the fading, shimmering form until it was completely lost in the dense foliage of the woods. I waited another 10 minutes, heart pounding, to be absolutely sure it was gone, that it wasn't simply a trick, a feint. Then slowly, carefully, I rose from my hiding spot. I moved with exaggerated stealth, my boots barely disturbing the leaves, making my way towards the church. The air felt heavy, charged with a new urgency. I crept through the gaping doorway of the church, the silence inside even more oppressive than before. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light, creating an ethereal, almost spectral atmosphere. I made my way to the splintered internal door to the clock tower. It was still ajar, exactly as I had left it. I paused, listening intently. Only the faint creaks of the ancient church, the distant whisper of the wind, no hums, no movement from below. Taking a deep, fortifying breath, I pushed the door open further and stepped into the cold, dark antechamber. I flicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. The wooden stairs, narrow and worn, seemed to beckon me down into the earth once more. I started my descent, moving quickly but cautiously, my heart hammering against my ribs. My earlier fear of the unknown depths was now replaced by a more focused anxiety, the fear of being discovered, of being trapped. I remembered the creature's cold grip, its silent, insistent push. I didn't want to repeat that experience. As I descended, the metallic, earthy scent grew stronger, mixed with that faint, acrid tang. The air grew colder, heavier. The sounds of the world above faded, replaced by the profound silence of the earth. I reached the bottom landing, the heavy, iron-banded door to the chamber before me. I pushed down the ornate handle. It turned with a familiar grating sound, and the door swung inward. The chamber was bathed in the soft, amber glow of the crude lamp. The air was still and cold, thick with the scent of the earth and the faint, residual metallic aroma. And the chamber was empty. The altar, with its arrangement of metal, stones, and bone, sat undisturbed in the center. The shallow depressions on the floor, the rough earthenware bowls, all were there just as I had seen them. But the figures were gone, all of them. My mind reeled. They were gone, all of them, even the one I had seen disappear into the woods. They had left the altar active, or at least visible, and the crude lamp burning. What did this mean? Had they all gone out, or had they simply moved deeper into the earth, into some other hidden passage? I stepped into the chamber, my flashlight beam sweeping across the rough-hewn walls. The silence was absolute, save for the frantic pounding of my heart. I approached the altar, my eyes fixed on the pulsating arrangement. It was still emitting that faint, rhythmic glow, the luminous veins in the stones pulsing faintly. I moved closer, drawn by an irresistible urge. I reached out a trembling hand, hovering it over the altar, almost touching the intricate arrangement. The tiny gear, still nestled in the crescent moon, seemed to hum faintly under my fingertips. This was it, the heart of their operation, the control mechanism for the clock. But what else did it control? What other power did it hold? My hand slowly, cautiously reached out, my fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface of the largest brass gear. It was exquisitely crafted, smooth and cold under my touch. And then I made a mistake, a grave, irreversible mistake. Driven by a desperate impulse, a need to test, to understand, I gently, tentatively rotated the tiny, stylized gear in the center of the crescent moon, just a fraction of an inch. The pulsation from the altar intensified immediately, flaring brighter, more powerful than before. The luminous veins in the stones glowed with an aggressive, vibrant intensity, casting long, dancing shadows across the chamber. The low thrumming in the air returned, stronger now, shaking the very ground beneath my feet, resonating deep within my chest, a powerful, almost painful vibration. I froze. My hand, still on the gear, felt the surge of power. A raw, primal energy that resonated through the brass, through my fingertips, up my arm, and into my very core. The light from the luminous stones pulsed aggressively, a blinding, emerald-green radiance now, reflecting off the rough-hewn walls, making the shadows dance like tormented spirits. The thrumming in the air escalated, vibrating not just in the ground, but in my teeth, my bones, my skull, threatening to shatter my eardrums. It was no longer a low-frequency hum. It was a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. I yanked my hand back as if burned, stumbling away from the altar, my eyes wide with terror and a dawning, horrifying realization. I had done something profound, something I didn't understand. The chamber itself seemed to respond. Fine cracks spiderwebbed across the packed earth walls, dust raining down in thin rivulets. A low groan, like the deep sigh of the earth itself, emanated from all around me. The crude lamp, still burning, flickered wildly, its amber glow struggling against the overwhelming green light of the altar. Then, from the ceiling directly above the altar, a section of rock began to shift. Slowly, ponderously, a large, circular slab of stone, perfectly carved, began to lower itself. It descended with an agonizingly slow grind of stone against stone, revealing an opening above it. My breath hitched. Another passage, or something else. As the slab continued its descent, revealing more of the opening, the green light from the altar intensified further, casting an almost hypnotic glow upwards. The thrumming reached a crescendo, a sound that was now a physical force pressing in on me from all sides. My vision blurred, my ears rang, and a sickening wave of dizziness washed over me. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it was useless. The sound was inside me, a vibration through my entire body. Then, through the cacophony, a new sound emerged, a high-pitched, resonant shriek. It was piercing, utterly alien, and filled with a raw, desperate agony. It didn't come from the chamber, but from above, echoing down through the newly opened shaft. My blood ran cold. That shriek, it sounded like it was filled with unimaginable pain, a sound that grated on my very soul, and it was coming from the direction of the clock tower. What had I done? By turning that gear, had I activated some defense mechanism, triggered an alarm, or had I hurt something? The circular slab reached its lowest point, revealing a gaping, perfectly round shaft ascending into impenetrable darkness. The green light from the altar pulsed upwards, illuminating nothing but the rough-hewn sides of the shaft for a few feet before being swallowed by the gloom. And then silence. The deafening roar ceased abruptly. The green light from the altar snapped off, plunging the chamber into near-total darkness, broken only by the feeble flicker of the crude lamp. The earth stopped trembling. The dust settled. The sudden transition from overwhelming sensory overload to absolute silence was almost as shocking as the noise itself. My ears rang, a high-pitched whine that slowly faded, leaving an unnerving quiet in its wake. My heart hammered, a frantic, lone drumbeat in the oppressive stillness. I stumbled backwards away from the altar, away from the newly opened shaft, until my back hit the rough wall of the chamber. My flashlight, which I had retrieved and held clenched in my hand, was still off. I fumbled for the button, my fingers trembling uncontrollably, and clicked it on. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the altar, the metal and stone pieces now inert, devoid of their eerie glow. My eyes darted to the ceiling. The circular slab was still lowered, leaving the dark shaft exposed. A faint, almost imperceptible metallic scent, stronger than before, drifted down from it. I stood there gasping for breath, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The initial terror of being discovered by the creatures had been replaced by a new, more profound dread. I had activated something, and that scream. Before I could even begin to process the implications, a new sound, faint but distinct, reached my ears from the now open shaft above. A scuttling, slithering sound, and then a low, guttural growl. My blood ran cold. The creatures, they were coming. They had been alerted. And that growl, it sounded nothing like their low, resonant hums. It was menacing, filled with a raw, animalistic fury. I didn't wait. My earlier caution about observing without being seen vanished, replaced by a desperate, primal urge to survive. I spun around, heading for the narrow passage I had originally entered through. I could hear the scuttling growing louder, closer, echoing down the shaft. I scrambled into the tunnel, not bothering to be quiet, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the rough walls. I could hear them now, multiple sets of them, moving with an unnatural speed, their growls deepening, echoing through the earth. They were enraged. I moved as fast as I could, hunched over, stumbling in the dark, my boots sliding on the damp earth. The cold air rushed past me, carrying the metallic scent, now tinged with something else, a faint, almost coppery smell like fresh blood. The passage seemed endless. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I pushed myself harder, driven by the terrifying sounds behind me. The growls were closer now, followed by a faint, rhythmic clicking sound like claws on stone. I reached the turn, the one that led to the final ascent, and risked a glance over my shoulder. In the distance, at the mouth of the chamber, I saw them. Not one, but two figures, their elongated forms outlined by the faint flicker of the crude lamp. Their black eyes gleamed with an infernal intensity, and they moved with a speed that defied their spindly appearance. They were not just walking, they were almost gliding, their bodies a blur in the dim light, propelled by an unseen force. Panic seized me, a cold, unreasoning terror. They were fast, far faster than I could ever hope to be in this confined space. I scrambled up the final incline of the passage, desperate to reach the internal door. My fingers scrabbled at the rough earth, trying to find purchase. The growls were right behind me now, echoing in the confined space, vibrating through the rock. I burst out of the tunnel into the clock tower antechamber, gasping for air, almost colliding with the heavy, iron-banded door to the passage. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping frantically. They were right there at the mouth of the tunnel, their black eyes blazing. One of them lunged. It moved with a sickening speed, its long, spindly arm reaching out, its fingers tipped with those faint, translucent nails. I screamed, a raw, terrified sound, and instinctively threw up my arm to shield my face. Its hand connected with my forearm, a cold, surprisingly powerful impact that sent a jolt of pain through me. Its grip was like iron, unyielding. I struggled, trying to pull away, but it held fast. Its face, smooth and featureless, was inches from mine, its black eyes burning into my soul. A low, guttural snarl vibrated from its chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. The other creature emerged from the tunnel, its gaze fixed on me, its body tensed. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a desperate, primal instinct for survival. I wasn't going to just stand there and be taken. I had a weapon, a small, inadequate weapon, but a weapon nonetheless. With my free hand, I fumbled for the utility knife in my pocket. My fingers closed around the cold metal, and I yanked it out, flicking open the small blade with a desperate click. Without thinking, driven by pure terror, I lunged forward, not trying to escape, but to defend. I brought the knife down, aiming for its arm, the part that was holding me. The blade connected. Not with a human scream, but a different sound. A high-pitched, metallic clang like striking tempered steel. A shower of faint, almost invisible sparks flew as the blade scraped against its translucent skin. The creature recoiled not in pain, but in surprise. Its grip on my arm loosened for a split second. Its black eyes widened, not with fear, but with an unfathomable intensity. I seized the opportunity, twisting my arm free with a desperate wrench. The creature stumbled back, momentarily disoriented. "Get away from me!" I screamed, my voice raw and hoarse, more a plea than a command. I brandished the small knife, its blade glinting uselessly in the flashlight beam. The two creatures paused, their black eyes fixed on the knife, then on me. Their growls subsided, replaced by a low, vibrating hum that was unlike their previous calm vocalizations. This was a hum of confused, almost bewildered frustration. They didn't seem hurt. The knife had barely left a mark on its incredibly resilient skin. but the unexpected attack, the defiance, had clearly taken them aback. I didn't wait to see their next move. I turned and scrambled up the wooden stairs, taking two at a time, my legs burning with effort. The ancient wood groaned under my weight, each creak echoing ominously in the silent tower. I reached the top landing, bursting into the clock mechanism chamber. The pre-dawn light was now filtering through the empty clock face, casting long, eerie shadows. The enormous clockworks, silent and imposing, loomed around me. I didn't stop. I ran to the internal door that led out into the crumbling church. I yanked it open, not bothering with stealth, and burst out into the wider space. The church was a labyrinth of shadows and fallen masonry. I didn't care. I ran blindly towards the gaping main entrance, towards the faint promise of the outside world. I didn't look back. I didn't listen for their pursuit. I just ran, my heart a frantic drumbeat in my chest, my mind consumed by a single, overriding thought: escape. I stumbled out of the church, gasping for breath, into the chill, pre-dawn air. The sky was a bruised purple, the forest a dark, menacing wall around the clearing. I didn't pause. I turned and ran, not towards my cabin, not towards the main path, but blindly into the dense woods, away from Oakhaven, away from the clock tower, away from the horrors beneath the earth. Branches whipped at my face, roots tripped my feet, but I kept running, fueled by pure, unreasoning terror. I didn't know where I was going, only that it had to be away. Away from the creatures, away from the pulsating altar, away from the metallic clang of my knife against alien skin. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out, until I collapsed against the rough bark of an ancient oak, panting, sobbing, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, but the light brought no comfort. The woods, once my solace, now felt like a vast, indifferent prison. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, curled in a fetal position, trying to calm my ragged breathing, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. The events of the last few hours replayed in my mind like a terrifying fever dream. The open shaft, the agonizing shriek, the enraged creatures, the almost impenetrable skin. The shriek, that sound resonated in my mind, a haunting echo of pain. What had I done? Had my manipulation of the gear unleashed something, injured something, awakened something far worse than the creatures themselves? And the metallic clang of my knife, it had seemed so frail against their resilience. They were not flesh and blood as I understood it. They were something else, something ancient and incredibly durable. As the sun climbed higher, casting dappled light through the canopy, a cold, hard resolve began to crystallize amidst my terror. I was still terrified, yes, but the flight instinct was slowly giving way to something else, a desperate need to understand. I had opened a door, a terrifying, impossible door. I couldn't simply run away and pretend it never happened. My academic integrity, my very nature as an anthropologist, demanded answers. But I needed a plan. I needed to think. I couldn't go back into that chamber unprepared, certainly not with them enraged. I needed to understand what that gear controlled, what that shriek was, and what that open shaft led to. I slowly pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest. My clothes were torn, my face scratched, my hands scraped and bleeding. I looked like I had wrestled with a wild animal, and in a way I had. My backpack was still at the cabin. My camera, my notes, my GPS, all crucial. I had to go back, but not directly, not without caution. I spent the next few hours cautiously circling Oak Haven, keeping to the deepest parts of the woods, avoiding any clearings or paths. I moved like a hunted animal, my senses hyper-alert, listening for any sound that wasn't the natural rustle of leaves or the chirping of birds. I scanned the tree lines, half expecting to see one of those elongated figures phasing through the foliage. The village itself remained silent, a ghost town under the morning sun. The church, from my distant vantage point, seemed ordinary, its crumbling stones telling no tales of the hidden horrors beneath. Eventually, hunger and thirst drove me. I needed supplies. I needed to retrieve my equipment. I needed to get back to the cabin. I approached the cabin from a circuitous route, moving slowly, checking every shadow, every bush. I saw no signs of disturbance. The front door was still closed, the windows dark. It looked utterly peaceful, a haven of normalcy in a world turned upside down. I slipped inside, closing and locking the door behind me with renewed fervor. The heavy trunk was still propped against it, a ridiculous but comforting barrier. My cabin, my sanctuary, it felt impossibly fragile now. I immediately went for my backpack, checking its contents. Everything seemed to be there. My camera, fresh notebook, extra batteries. I took out my GPS device. It was a rugged, handheld unit designed for remote fieldwork. I turned it on. It acquired satellite signal quickly, displaying my current coordinates. More importantly, it had a mapping function. My eyes fell on the screen, the small dot representing my position, and then I scrolled out, looking at the topographical map of the area. The small, isolated cabin, the winding forest roads, and Oak Haven, a cluster of old buildings and ruins, and the church with its distinctive clock tower icon. I zoomed in on the clock tower. I knew roughly where the underground chamber was and where the narrow passage exited. I traced the path I had taken, mentally mapping the subterranean world onto the surface. Then a thought struck me, that newly opened shaft. It went up towards the clock tower. What if it led directly into the clock mechanism itself, or somewhere even higher? My gaze drifted to the ancient map of Oak Haven, still spread across my table. The original town layout, the church, the old quarry, the faint, almost erased lines that ran beneath the earth, lines I had dismissed as old mining tunnels or forgotten conduits. What if those lines were more than just tunnels? What if they were part of a vast, subterranean network, a network built or inhabited by these creatures? My blood ran cold as I considered the possibility. This wasn't just a hidden chamber. It was potentially an entire hidden world existing beneath Oak Haven, hidden from humanity for centuries, perhaps millennia. I needed to know more about the chimes. The 4 chimes at 3:17 a.m. What did they signify? A countdown, a measurement of something, a ritualistic marker. I pulled out my phone again, even though I knew there was no service, but I had downloaded some offline mapping apps and a celestial navigation app. I opened the celestial app. I input the date and time of the chimes, 3:17 a.m. The app showed the positions of the stars, the moon, and the planets at that exact moment. I stared at the display, trying to find a pattern, an alignment, anything significant. Nothing immediately jumped out at me. But then my eyes caught something else. The sun, at 3:17 a.m., the sun was, of course, on the opposite side of the earth, the deepest part of the night, the time of darkness. A faint, unsettling connection. What if the chimes were marking something related to the sun, its absence, its lowest point, its maximum distance, or perhaps something entirely different, something related to the subterranean world and its relationship to the surface? I needed to observe the altar again, but I couldn't risk going back into the chamber while they were enraged. I had to find a way to observe without being detected, or at least without being trapped. My thoughts turned to the creature I had seen emerging from the church, the one that had phased, distorted, and glided into the woods. If they could do that, if they could move unseen, how could I ever hope to observe them? Unless they had a pattern, a routine. The one I had seen was alone. Perhaps they operated individually at certain times or for certain tasks. I decided my next step had to be reconnaissance. I needed to learn their habits, their movements, their patrol routes if they had any. And I needed to do it from a safe distance, far away from the clock tower's immediate vicinity. I spent the rest of the day planning, sketching out observation points around the village, noting potential cover and escape routes. I gathered what little food I had, rationing it carefully. I refilled my water bottle. I packed a small emergency kit, a first aid kit, some rope, extra flashlight batteries, a small mirror for signaling, though who I would signal I had no idea. As dusk approached, the familiar sense of dread returned, amplified by the knowledge of what awaited me. The village, cloaked in twilight, seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I waited until full darkness had settled, then, armed with my backpack, my GPS, and a renewed, albeit terrifying, resolve, I slipped out of the cabin. I didn't head straight for Oakhaven. Instead, I circled wide, using the dense woods as cover, approaching the village from the north, an area I hadn't explored yet. My goal was not to enter the church, but to observe it from a distance. I wanted to see if the phasing creature returned. I wanted to see if any other activity became apparent. I moved with painstaking slowness, my flashlight off, relying on the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The forest, once merely disorienting, now felt actively hostile, filled with unseen eyes. I found a vantage point on a small rise overlooking the northern edge of the village, partially obscured by a thick cluster of pines. From here, I had a decent view of the church's main entrance and the clock tower, though it was still quite a distance. I settled down, pulling out my binoculars. The church stood dark and silent, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised night sky. The clock face was a black void. Hours passed. The air grew colder, and a thin mist began to rise from the low-lying areas of the village, swirling around the ancient ruins like spectral shrouds. The night was eerily quiet, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I strained my eyes, focusing on the church entrance. No shimmer, no distortion, no sign of activity. My mind began to wander, grappling with the sheer impossibility of what I had witnessed. These creatures, where did they come from? How did they remain hidden for so long? What was their true purpose? Were they benevolent, malicious, or simply indifferent, caught up in their own ancient existence? The thought of Dr. Thorne returned. He had dismissed the legends as folklore, as psychological phenomena. How would he react to this? To actual physical evidence of an impossible hidden civilization? Would he believe me? Or would he think I had lost my mind in the isolation of the woods? I knew I couldn't tell him until I had more concrete evidence, more understanding. A trembling anthropologist babbling about alien beings living under a clock tower would likely be laughed out of academia. As the night deepened, the familiar anxiety of the approaching hour began to prickle at me. 3:17 a.m., the time of the chimes. I braced myself, my eyes fixed on the clock tower. And then it happened. Dong. The first chime, deep and resonant, vibrated through the still night air, echoing across the silent village. My breath hitched. Dong. The second, a heavy, profound tone that seemed to shake the very earth beneath me. Dong. The third, a lingering sound that resonated deep within my chest. Dong. The fourth, a final, powerful reverberation that slowly faded into the profound silence, leaving an unnerving emptiness in its wake. 4 chimes exactly as before, and I was out here watching. This time I knew it wasn't me or my accidental rotation of the gear. They were continuing their ritual. But why? The chimes ceased, but the feeling of unease, of intense scrutiny, remained. I scanned the church, the clock tower, the surrounding ruins. Nothing, no movement. No light other than the faint flicker of the crude lamp from deep within the earth, which I knew was there even if I couldn't see it. But then, just as I was about to dismiss any further activity, I saw it. A faint shimmer, not from the church entrance this time, but from the side of the clock tower, right where the narrow, internal passage led to the underground chamber. My heart leaped into my throat. I raised my binoculars, trying to focus, but the light was too dim, the distortion too subtle. It was almost like a heat haze, but without the heat. Then the distortion grew clearer, shimmering into being. An elongated shape, translucent, almost invisible, began to emerge from the side of the clock tower. It was one of them. It wasn't using the main church entrance, nor was it phasing in and out of the building. It was phasing out of the very stone of the clock tower itself. My mind reeled. They weren't just using hidden passages or doors. They could move through solid matter, or at least their forms could become insubstantial enough to pass through it. This was an ability far beyond anything I had imagined. It explained how they could remain so utterly hidden for so long. The figure solidified slowly, almost ponderously, in the shadow of the clock tower. It stood there for a moment, its conical head slowly turning, its black, depthless eyes sweeping across the clearing. Even from this distance, I felt the chilling weight of its gaze, as if it could see through the darkness, through the trees, directly into my hiding spot. I held my breath, pressing myself deeper into the cover of the pines, trying to become one with the shadows. The creature then began to move. It wasn't gliding into the woods this time. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, its long, spindly limbs carrying it towards the very center of the clearing, towards the spot where the old well shaft was located. I focused my binoculars, trying to see what it was doing. It reached the well, its gaunt form illuminated faintly by the moonlight. It stopped at the edge of the well, and then, with agonizing slowness, it lowered its head, peering down into the dark abyss. It stayed there for a long moment, utterly still, its black eyes seemingly fixed on something within the well's depths. Then it slowly raised one of its impossibly long, pale arms. Its fingers twitched, almost as if it were performing some delicate, unseen manipulation. And then a faint, almost imperceptible sound drifted across the clearing from the direction of the well. A low, soft clink, like something small and metallic being dropped or collected. What was it doing? Was the well connected to their underground network? Was it a source of something, a disposal site, or was it another part of their ritual, another node in their mysterious system? After another long moment, the creature slowly straightened up. It turned, its head sweeping across the clearing once more, then it began to move back towards the clock tower. With the same subtle shimmer, it began to phase back into the solid stone, its form distorting, blurring, until it was completely gone, leaving nothing but the silent, empty clock tower. I stayed absolutely still for another hour, long after the creature had vanished, my mind racing with the new, disturbing information. Phasing through solid matter, that changed everything. It meant the internal passage I had found was just one of their ways in and out. They could be anywhere, emerge anywhere. And the well, the old, disused well that I had noted on my map but never investigated. It was clearly important. The chimes, followed by the creature's emergence and its actions at the well, this wasn't random. It was a sequence, a ritualistic cycle. I knew then what I had to do. I had to investigate the well. But I couldn't do it now in the dark with the risk of another creature emerging. I needed daylight. I needed to approach with extreme caution. I returned to my cabin as the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, my mind buzzing with a desperate clarity. My terror was still there, but it was now laced with a steely determination. I had a deeper understanding of their abilities, a clearer picture of their patterns. This was a war of wits, a battle for understanding against an ancient, inscrutable intelligence, and I was starting to gather my intelligence. The next day passed in a similar state of hyper-alert preparation. I slept fitfully, haunted by images of black eyes and shimmering forms. I reviewed my notes, adding the new observations. Phasing through rock, the significance of the well, the sequential nature of their actions after the chimes. I spent hours poring over the old maps of Oakhaven, trying to find any connection between the clock tower, the well, and the old quarry I had read about. The quarry was located on the western edge of the village, a much larger excavation than the well. What if it was another entry point? Another part of their network. As the sun began to set, I felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. Tonight, I wouldn't just observe, I would act, but cautiously. I packed my bag with more tools this time, a longer, sturdier rope, a small, collapsible shovel, more powerful batteries for my flashlight, and perhaps foolishly my small utility knife, more for psychological comfort than actual defense. I waited until the deepest part of the night, long after the chimes, before making my move. I approached the village from the north again, but this time I headed directly for the well. I moved slowly, stealthily, my flashlight off, letting the faint moonlight guide me. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The ancient ruins of Oakhaven loomed around me, silent and watchful. I reached the well, its circular stone lip a dark maw against the faint glimmer of the night. I cautiously approached, my heart pounding in my chest. The well was deep, the darkness within absolute. I peered over the edge, trying to discern anything in the inky blackness. Nothing but the faint echo of my own breath. I carefully set down my backpack and pulled out my rope. I tied one end securely around a thick, moss-covered stone, testing its strength. It held firm. Then I slowly, cautiously lowered the other end of the rope into the well. It descended into the darkness, seeming to go on forever. I didn't hear a splash. It was dry. I turned on my flashlight, pointing its beam down the well shaft. The light plunged into the darkness, revealing rough, moss-covered stone walls glistening with moisture. The shaft was perfectly circular, descending straight down. My beam reached the bottom. It was not a pool of water, but a small, circular chamber, perhaps 10 feet in diameter. And in the center of that chamber, gleaming faintly in my flashlight beam, was a single, intricately carved stone tablet. My breath hitched. Another artifact, another piece of the puzzle. This wasn't just a well, it was an access point, and it contained something important. I knew I had to go down. The risk was immense, but the pull of discovery was irresistible. This was a chance to get a closer look at their artifacts, perhaps to understand their purpose without having to enter their main chamber. I took a deep, fortifying breath. I secured the rope around my waist, double-checking the knot. Then, slowly, carefully, I began to lower myself into the well shaft, my feet finding purchase on the rough stones, my hands gripping the rope. The descent was slow and precarious. The air grew colder, heavier, filled with the scent of damp earth and that faint, metallic tang. The stone walls pressed in on me, and the darkness below seemed to yawn like a waiting maw. Finally, my feet touched solid ground. I was in the small, circular chamber at the bottom of the well. I quickly untied myself from the rope, letting it hang slack. My flashlight beam immediately found the stone tablet. It was approximately 3 feet in diameter, perfectly circular, and lay flat on the ground. Its surface was covered in a maze of intricate carvings, swirling patterns that seemed to pulse faintly under my light. They weren't hieroglyphs or symbols I recognized from any known human civilization. They were utterly alien, yet possessed a strange, mesmerizing beauty. I knelt, peering closer. The stone itself was dark, almost black, with faint, crystalline veins running through it that seemed to absorb and reflect my flashlight beam in odd ways. It was similar to the luminous stones on the altar, but larger and without the internal glow. I ran my gloved hand over the surface, feeling the cool, smooth stone, the raised edges of the carvings. They felt incredibly ancient, worn by countless centuries, yet still sharply defined. As my fingers traced a particularly complex swirl, I felt a faint vibration emanate from the stone. A subtle thrum, similar to the one I had felt in the main chamber, but much fainter, almost imperceptible. My heart pounded. This wasn't just a tablet, it was active, it was connected. To what? The altar, the clock, the entire subterranean network. I pulled out my camera, taking multiple photos from different angles, trying to capture every detail of the alien carvings. Then I pulled out my notebook, sketching the patterns as best I could, making notes on the texture of the stone, the faint vibration. As I worked, a new detail caught my eye. Near the edge of the tablet, almost hidden by a slight overhang of the well wall, was a small, almost invisible indentation. It was perfectly circular, about the size of a coin, and seemed unnaturally smooth against the rough stone. I leaned closer, shining my flashlight on it. It wasn't just an indentation, it was a shallow depression, a socket. It looked like something was meant to fit inside it. I remembered the creatures at the altar arranging the metal fragments, the polished stones, the carved bone pieces, the small, stylized gear they had rotated. Was this socket meant for a similar component? I reached into my pocket, pulling out my utility knife, not to use as a weapon but as a tool. Its tip was small enough to probe the indentation. I gently inserted the tip. It fit perfectly. As the metal tip touched the socket, the faint thrumming from the tablet intensified slightly, a subtle vibration that I could now feel distinctly through my fingers. My mind raced. Was this a keyhole, a trigger, a place to insert another component to activate something? I pulled the knife out, hesitating. I had already triggered an unknown event once. I had unleashed a shriek of pain and enraged the creatures. What would happen if I activated this? But my curiosity, my anthropologist's drive, was a powerful force. I had to know, I had to understand. I looked around the small chamber, no obvious exits other than the well shaft above, no hiding places. If something went wrong, I was trapped. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I needed more information. This was a direct link to their system. I carefully, slowly, reached into my pocket again. This time I pulled out one of the small, smooth, dark stones that I had collected from the surface of the Oakhaven clearing on my first day, thinking they were merely interesting geological samples. They were smooth, almost polished, and had faint, luminous veins running through them, exactly like the ones on the altar. I had put them in my pocket out of idle curiosity, a geologist's instinct for interesting rock. Now, as I held it, I realized these were their stones. I had taken one of their components. I looked at the stone in my hand, then at the small, circular socket on the tablet. They weren't quite the same size. The stone was slightly too large to fit perfectly into the indentation. It seemed the socket was designed for something smaller, more precise, like a tiny gear or a carved bone piece. Disappointment and a faint sense of relief washed over me. I couldn't activate it even if I wanted to. The piece didn't fit. But then another thought sparked. The creature at the well had performed some delicate manipulation with its fingers. What if it wasn't about inserting a piece, but about activating the socket itself, perhaps with a finger? A thought, cold and sharp, pierced through my fear. What if the creature hadn't inserted anything, but rather removed something, or performed a complex sequence of touches, a subtle dance of manipulation that mimicked the rotation of the gear in the altar chamber? I pulled my hand back from the tablet, my breath held. The small stone in my pocket felt warm, almost humming against my leg. My own mundane utility knife, still clutched in my other hand, seemed ridiculously inadequate. I looked at the socket again, then at the intricate carvings around it. They formed a swirling pattern like a miniature galaxy or perhaps a complex circuit diagram. Could the clink have been a sound of a subtle mechanism engaging or disengaging? My anthropologist's brain, despite the terror, was buzzing with theories. This was a control panel, a subsidiary node to the main altar. The creatures weren't just observing the chimes, they were actively engaging with this network. I leaned closer, my flashlight beam illuminating the carvings around the socket. They were not merely decorative. There was a faint, almost invisible texture to them, like tiny, raised nodes or depressions that could be felt more than seen. And around the socket itself, a series of radiating lines, like spokes of a wheel, each terminating in a tiny, almost microscopic indentation. Could it be a combination, a sequence, a tactile code? The air in the well chamber was growing colder, the dampness seeping into my clothes, but I barely noticed. My focus was entirely on the tablet. I carefully, gently traced the lines around the socket with my fingertip. The faint thrumming intensified slightly with each touch, confirming the active nature of the stone. As I traced, I noticed that some of the tiny indentations at the end of the lines felt smoother, almost worn, as if frequently touched. Others felt rougher, unused. A new idea, audacious and terrifying, began to form. What if the creature at the well was calibrating something, or collecting something from this tablet? And what if, by observing its movements, I could replicate its actions? I remembered the creature's slow, deliberate raising of its arm, the twitching of its fingers. It hadn't just dropped something, it had manipulated something. I looked at my own fingers, then back at the tablet. Could I risk it, risk activating another unknown event? After the shriek, after the rage of the creatures in the tunnel, the thought sent a fresh wave of panic through me. But the desire to understand, to decode this alien technology was overwhelming. I was here now, trapped at the bottom of a well, surrounded by the unknown. I had to push forward. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I needed to be methodical. I needed to understand the effect of each interaction. I began by pressing one of the worn indentations near the socket lightly. The thrumming intensified momentarily, then faded back to its baseline. Nothing else happened. No light, no sound. I tried another worn indentation. Same result. Then I tried one of the rougher, seemingly untouched indentations. As my finger pressed it, the thrumming intensified, and this time, a faint, almost imperceptible pulse of light emanated from the crystalline veins within the tablet. It was so subtle I almost missed it, a ghostly flicker that vanished as soon as my finger lifted. My eyes widened. There it was, a response, different points, different reactions. This was definitely an interface. I experimented further, carefully touching different indentations, trying to discern a pattern. Some caused a stronger thrum, others the faint light pulse, others seemed to do nothing at all. It was like a complex lock or a cryptic keyboard with unknown functions. My mind went back to the clock, the chimes, 4 of them at 3:17 a.m. every night. A recurring ritual. Could this tablet be used to control the chimes or monitor them? I looked at the socket again, then at the central swirling pattern on the tablet. It reminded me faintly of a clock face, a circular representation of time or cycles. What if the creature wasn't just activating it, but reading it, or perhaps calibrating it for the next cycle? I pulled out my camera again, this time to record my own interactions. I set it up on a small ledge, angling it to capture my hands and the tablet. I needed to document everything. I began to methodically touch each of the tiny indentations, recording the results. Thrum, pulse, nothing, thrum, pulse, pulse. The process was slow, painstaking, and excruciatingly tense. Each touch felt like an act of defiance, a challenge to the hidden intelligence that had crafted this artifact. After about 20 minutes of this careful, documented experimentation, I began to notice a very subtle pattern. The pulses of light seemed to follow a sequence, a rhythm that was not immediately obvious but hinted at a larger design. and some of the pulses were stronger, more vibrant, almost like a brief flash. As I pressed one of these stronger pulsing points, the thrumming from the tablet abruptly changed. It deepened, becoming more resonant, almost like a low, sustained chord. And then, from deep within the well shaft, from somewhere above me, a faint, metallic clink echoed down. My heart leaped, the same clink I had heard the night before. I froze, my finger still on the pulsing point. What had I done? Had I replicated the creature's action? Was it a confirmation, an activation? I waited, my senses straining. The resonant thrum from the tablet continued, a steady, low vibration. The faint metallic clink didn't repeat. I slowly lifted my finger. The thrumming faded back to its baseline and the faint light pulse ceased. What did that clink signify? Had something been deposited or removed? I shined my flashlight up the well shaft, but it was just rough stone, glistening with moisture. Nothing seemed to have changed. My gaze returned to the tablet, specifically the circular socket. Could the clink have been something within the socket, a micro-mechanism? I leaned in, examining the socket more closely. It was perfectly smooth, almost polished. And as I peered, I noticed something incredible. On the inner rim of the socket, almost invisible to the naked eye, were three tiny, almost microscopic metallic teeth like the cogs of an impossibly small gear. They were retracted, flush with the surface of the socket. My breath caught. It was a gear mechanism, an internal one. The creature's delicate manipulation wasn't just touching, it was probably interacting with these internal gears, or perhaps inserting a compatible micro-sized component. I remembered the tiny gear on the altar, the one I had rotated, and these teeth, they were designed to engage with something similar. What if the creature inserted something into this socket, rotated it, and then removed it, and the clink was the sound of insertion or removal, or perhaps the locking mechanism of the internal gears? The thought of what I might have inadvertently done the night before by touching the main altar gear sent a fresh shiver down my spine. I had caused a shriek, an uproar. This tablet, though smaller, was clearly part of the same system. I knew I couldn't replicate the creature's full action without the right component, but I had activated a response, a specific one that produced the clink. This meant I had, at least partially, understood its purpose. I continued my documentation, sketching the patterns, making detailed notes of the indentations and their responses. The small chamber was oppressive, the air growing heavier, but I forced myself to focus, to gather as much information as I could before I had to leave. I knew my time was limited. The sun would be rising soon, and I couldn't risk being caught down here in broad daylight. More importantly, I couldn't risk the creatures discovering my presence. They were enraged. As I finished my notes and packed up my camera, I felt a familiar vibration. A low, rhythmic thrumming, not from the tablet, but from the earth itself. It was faint at first, then slowly intensified, a deep resonance that vibrated through the stone walls of the well chamber, through my bones. My blood ran cold. It was the sound of the creatures, or more precisely, the sound of their system coming to life. I looked at the tablet. Its crystalline veins were now glowing faintly, not with the aggressive emerald light of the altar, but with a soft, pulsing azure. The internal gears of the socket emitted a barely perceptible hum. They were aware the system was activating, and I was trapped at the bottom of a well 100 feet beneath the earth. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at my throat. I had to get out, now. I scrambled for the rope, fumbling with the knot, my fingers suddenly clumsy with terror. The thrumming intensified, growing louder, closer. I could hear it now, not just as a vibration, but as a distinct, low-frequency hum that seemed to echo from all around me, as if the entire earth was breathing. I yanked on the rope, testing its security, then began my frantic ascent. My legs burned, my arms ached, but I pulled myself upwards with a desperate strength I didn't know I possessed. The damp stone scraped against my body, my hands slipped on the wet rope, but I kept climbing, eyes fixed on the distant circle of moonlight above. The humming grew into a powerful, resonant roar. It was a sound that seemed to precede the creatures, a sonic signature of their activated technology. It was coming from all directions, resonating through the very bedrock. As I climbed higher, the azure glow from the tablet below slowly faded, replaced by an overwhelming darkness, but the powerful hum continued, a relentless, deafening force. I pushed myself harder, gasping for breath, my muscles screaming in protest. My vision blurred, sweat stinging my eyes. The thought of those black, depthless eyes appearing at the bottom of the shaft, or worse, phasing through the stone walls, drove me to a frantic pace. Finally, agonizingly, I reached the lip of the well. I scrambled out, collapsing onto the rough ground, gasping for air, my body shaking uncontrollably. The hum from below was still audible, a deep, pervasive vibration through the earth, but here on the surface it was muted, more distant. I didn't waste a moment. I quickly untied the rope, bundled it haphazardly, and shoved it into my backpack. I grabbed my camera, my notes, everything, and scrambled to my feet. The first sliver of dawn was just beginning to paint the eastern sky. The air was cold, crisp, and blessedly silent, save for the distant hum from beneath the earth. I turned and ran, not back to my cabin, but deeper into the woods, away from Oakhaven, away from the well, away from the terrifying pulse of the unseen world beneath. I needed to put distance between myself and that place. I needed to think. I needed to process what I had learned, what I had done. I ran until my lungs burned, until the faint hum from Oakhaven was completely swallowed by the sounds of the waking forest. I found a dense thicket of spruce trees, their low-hanging branches providing excellent cover, and collapsed, my body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The sun rose higher, casting golden shafts of light through the trees, but the warmth brought little comfort. My mind was a whirlwind of images: the glowing altar, the enraged creatures, the resilient skin, the open shaft, the agonizing shriek, the alien tablet, the pulsing points, the metallic clink. I was no longer just an anthropologist on a discovery mission. I was an intruder. I had not only stumbled upon their existence, but had actively engaged with their technology, triggering responses I barely understood. I had put myself on their radar, a persistent, meddling threat. I pulled out my notebook and camera, desperate to review my documentation, to make sense of the chaotic influx of information. The pictures of the tablet, even in the dim light of the well, were clear. The intricate carvings, the socket, the worn and rough indentations, all faithfully recorded. I replayed the short video of my interaction, watching my finger press the various points, listening to the subtle changes in the thrumming, seeing the faint pulses of light. And then the stronger pulse, followed by the distant metallic clink. That clink, what was it? Was it a signal, a release, a locking mechanism engaging or disengaging? And what did it do? My mind went back to the creature at the well. It had lowered its head, peered into the well, then raised its arm and performed the delicate manipulation, followed by the clink. It wasn't just activating the tablet, it was interacting with something in the well. Could the clink be the sound of something being placed into the well or retrieved from it? I closed my eyes, trying to visualize the scene again, the creature peering down, its arm reaching, the clink. It had then straightened up and left. If it had been placing something, what and why in the well? If retrieving, what was it and why was it there? The sheer complexity of their system was staggering. The clock tower, the main altar chamber, the well tablet, all interconnected, all part of a larger, unseen mechanism. I started to sketch diagrams in my notebook, trying to map out the connections. The chimes, the altar, the well, what was the quarry? Was it another node? I pulled out the old Oakhaven map again, spreading it carefully on the forest floor. The church, the well, and the old quarry, a prominent, sprawling excavation to the west of the village. The map showed faint, almost erased lines connecting these points, lines I had initially dismissed. Now they screamed network. What if the chimes were a trigger, a signal for a creature to perform a specific action at the well, and what if the well was connected to the quarry? The quarry, I hadn't dared to approach it yet. It was a massive excavation, far more open and exposed than the well. It would be a dangerous place to observe, but if it was part of their network, it was a crucial piece of the puzzle. My thoughts were interrupted by a new realization. The shriek, the agonizing shriek that had echoed down the open shaft from the clock tower when I had rotated the altar gear. What was that? If the creatures were resilient, almost impervious to physical harm, as my knife had proven, then what could shriek with such agony? Something else. Something fragile, or something they cared about deeply. Could it have been the clock mechanism itself, or some living component connected to it? The creature's rage in the tunnel had been palpable, a terrifying, animalistic fury. They were not just disturbed by my presence, they were furious at my actions. This suggested that whatever I had impacted with the gear, it was profoundly important to them. My fear, though still a constant companion, was now tempered by a growing sense of responsibility. I had inadvertently unleashed something, disturbed something. I couldn't just abandon this. I had to understand. I spent the rest of the day in my secluded thicket, analyzing my notes, sketching, and planning. I ate the last of my power bars, rationing my water. I couldn't return to the cabin yet, not until I had a better understanding of their patterns, their movements. They were clearly enraged, and the cabin was an exposed target. As dusk approached, the forest grew silent, a deeper, more watchful quiet. The air grew cold, and the first stars began to pierce the bruised twilight sky. Tonight, I wouldn't just observe. I would use the map, my GPS, and my new understanding of their network to try and connect more dots. And I had a specific target in mind, the quarry. I waited until the moon was high, a sliver of silver cutting through the dense canopy. I moved slowly, cautiously, my flashlight off, navigating by moonlight and the familiar contours of the land. I skirted Oak Haven, keeping to the deepest shadows, moving west towards the quarry. The journey was long and arduous. The terrain grew rougher, the woods thicker. I imagined the creatures, perhaps moving silently beneath my feet, sensing my presence. The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the edge of the quarry. It was an immense, gaping maw in the earth, far larger than I had anticipated. The moonlight cast stark shadows across its jagged, terraced walls, revealing dark, cavernous openings along its sides. The air here was different. Colder, windier, carrying a faint, metallic scent that was stronger than anything I had encountered before. It was the smell of ancient rock, of exposed minerals, and something else, something subtle and unsettling, like ozone or burnt metal. I found a vantage point on a high ridge overlooking the quarry, concealed by a cluster of gnarled oaks. From here, I had a panoramic view of the entire excavation. It was vast. Terraced levels descended into a central, almost perfectly circular pit which seemed to go down into impenetrable darkness. Along the walls, I could discern numerous small caves and fissures, dark mouths in the rock face. I pulled out my binoculars, sweeping them across the quarry. Nothing moved. The place was utterly silent, a monument to human labor and a gaping wound in the earth. I set up my camera on a tripod, ready to capture anything that might happen. My GPS was open, marking my location relative to the quarry. Hours passed, the cold seeped into my bones. The quarry remained still, lifeless. No shimmer, no movement, no sound other than the mournful howl of the wind echoing off the sheer rock faces. Then, as the night deepened and the distant, familiar hour of 3:17 a.m. began to approach, I felt it again. The faint, subterranean thrumming. It was weaker here at the quarry, but undeniable. The creatures were active. Their system was alive. And then, precisely at 3:17 a.m., the chimes echoed across the silent landscape. Dong! The sound, deep and resonant, seemed to reverberate not just from the distant clock tower, but from the very earth beneath me. Dong! The second chime, profound and lingering. Dong! The third. Dong! The fourth, fading slowly into the vast emptiness of the quarry, leaving behind an unnerving silence. I gripped my binoculars, my eyes fixed on the quarry. What would happen here? Would a creature emerge as from the church or the clock tower? Would they interact with this place? The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. The thrumming from beneath the earth slowly faded. Then I saw it. Not a creature, not a shimmer, but a light. From deep within the central pit of the quarry, a faint, pulsing emerald green light began to emanate. It was subtle at first, just a faint glow, almost indistinguishable from the moonlight reflecting off damp rock. But then it slowly intensified, growing brighter, more vibrant. My heart pounded. It was the same emerald green light as the altar in the main chamber, the same pulsating, aggressive radiance. The light pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the jagged walls of the quarry. As it grew brighter, I realized it wasn't coming from a single point, but from a large, cavernous opening at the very bottom of the central pit, an opening I hadn't noticed before in the darkness. It was a portal, a gateway, or perhaps another core component of their system. The emerald light pulsed, growing to an almost blinding intensity, illuminating the entire quarry with an otherworldly glow. It was mesmerizing, terrifying. I could feel the heat radiating from it, even from my distant vantage point. And then through my binoculars, I saw movement. Not creatures emerging, but something else. Something in the air, directly above the pulsating light in the pit. It was faint, almost transparent, like a shimmering distortion in the air. But as I focused, I could make out intricate, geometric patterns forming and reforming within the distortion. They weren't solid, but appeared to be made of pure energy, glowing with a soft, internal luminescence that mirrored the emerald light below. These patterns began to rotate slowly at first, then faster, coalescing into what looked like a complex, three-dimensional construct of light and energy. It was beautiful and terrifying, utterly alien. It was a projection, a holographic display, or some form of energy manifestation. As the construct solidified, I noticed that the patterns within it were vaguely familiar. They were similar to the intricate carvings on the well tablet and to the designs I had glimpsed on the altar. They were alien symbols, but now, projected in 3 dimensions, they seemed to tell a story, to convey information. The patterns shifted, reformed, and then a series of images began to manifest within the light construct. Not static images, but almost like a flowing narrative, a sequence of scenes. My breath caught in my throat. This was communication. This was information. The first image was of a vast, star-filled cosmos. Galaxies spiraled, nebulae bloomed, stars pulsed with distant light. Then the view zoomed in rapidly through countless light years until a single blue-green planet filled the frame. Earth. My heart hammered. This was their story, their origin. The images flowed faster. The blue-green planet, then an interior view. Deep beneath the surface, a network of luminous veins pulsing with energy snaked through the earth, and within those veins, faint, elongated figures, the creatures. They were from the earth, or they had adapted to live within it, sustained by its hidden energies. The next sequence of images was of their civilization. Vast subterranean caverns lit by the same emerald light, filled with intricate structures that seemed to grow organically from the rock. More of the elongated figures moved within these caverns, tending to glowing altars, manipulating glowing mechanisms. It was a world of living stone, of pulsating energy, a mirror image of the surface world, but hidden. Then the narrative shifted. The surface world. Images of ancient human civilizations began to appear, primitive huts, early tools, then the construction of great monuments, the rise of cities, the development of technology. Always the creatures were shown observing from deep within the earth, their black eyes watching unseen. They had been here for millennia, witnessing, observing, hidden. The images accelerated, flowing like a river. Empires rose and fell. Wars raged. Progress marched on. And always beneath it all, the pulsating network of the creatures, their subtle presence influencing, guiding, perhaps even harvesting. A chilling thought struck me. Harvest, the disappearances in Oak Haven. The images then focused on Oak Haven itself. A small, bustling village centuries ago, the construction of the church, the clock tower, and beneath it the creatures observing the human efforts, subtly redirecting them, perhaps. The clock tower, an early point of interest. Then the images showed the clock tower, its mechanisms, and the glowing altar beneath it. The chimes, the four chimes at 3:17 a.m. In the projection, they were depicted as a synchronizing signal, a rhythmic pulse that resonated through the earth, activating various points in their network. And one of those points was the well. The projection showed a creature at the well performing the delicate manipulation, and then a subtle energy exchange, a faint, almost invisible wisp of light rising from the well into the air. And then the quarry, the pulsating emerald light in the pit, the energy construct above it. In the projection, the quarry was shown as a massive energy conduit, a primary nexus for the raw geological energy that sustained their civilization. The emerald light was the visible manifestation of this power, and the energy construct, a data display processing information. The images intensified, focusing on the current moment. The present, my arrival in Oak Haven, my accidental discovery of the first sound, my descent into the clock tower, my manipulation of the altar gear. Then the shriek. The projection showed the altar glowing emerald, but with a new, aggressive red pulse. And connected to it, deep within the earth, a massive, crystalline structure like a colossal heart, pulsating with a terrifying, fractured light. And from that structure, the shriek, a sound of immense pain and distress echoing through their network. My blood ran cold. The crystalline structure, that was what I had heard, that was what had shrieked. It was their power source, their heart, their very lifeblood. The creatures, shown as enraged, moved through their tunnels, their black eyes burning with fury, pursuing me. The image of my small utility knife scraping against their resilient skin flickered briefly. Then the projection shifted again, calming slightly but maintaining the red pulse in the crystalline heart. It showed the well, the creature's subsequent visit, its actions, and then a faint image of me approaching the well, then descending into it, manipulating the tablet. They knew they had been watching me all along, every step, every action, every interaction. The images faded, replaced by the geometric patterns, still rotating, still glowing with internal light. The emerald light from the quarry pit remained, pulsating with an almost angry intensity. I stood there transfixed, my mind reeling. Their entire history, their purpose, their network, and my role in it, all laid bare in a stunning, horrifying display of alien communication. They were not just hidden, they were an ancient, subterranean civilization living within the earth, sustained by its energies. They had been observing humanity for millennia, subtly influencing, always hidden. The chimes were a synchronization pulse, the altar a control mechanism, the well a data collection point or perhaps a minor energy node, and the quarry a main power conduit, a central processing unit for their vast geological energy network. And I had damaged their heart, their power source, their life. The rage of the creatures made sense now. I wasn't just an intruder, I was an attacker. I had threatened their very existence. What did they want now? Revenge, retribution? Or did they simply want to stop me from causing further damage? The energy construct in the quarry began to destabilize, the geometric patterns flickering and blurring. The emerald light from the pit began to dim, slowly, reluctantly. The raw power of the display was waning. As the light faded, a new sound began to emanate from the quarry pit. A low, persistent grinding sound, like massive stones shifting, moving into place, and then a deeper, more ominous clunk. My eyes darted to the pit. The emerald light was almost gone, but I could now see movement within the cavernous opening. Gigantic, perfectly carved stone blocks, far too large for any human machinery, were slowly moving, sealing off the entrance to the power conduit. They were closing it, sealing off the quarry, perhaps to protect it, or perhaps to trap something within, or to prevent me from ever accessing it again. The grinding grew louder, the clunking more frequent, as the colossal blocks moved with an impossibly slow, deliberate precision. The opening to their main energy nexus was disappearing, being absorbed back into the earth, just like their creatures could phase through solid matter. I knew then that I had to leave. I had seen too much, understood too much. And in doing so, I had made myself a target, a primary threat to their hidden world. I carefully, silently retreated from the quarry ridge, moving deeper into the woods. The sound of the grinding blocks slowly faded behind me until it was replaced by the familiar sounds of the forest. I didn't stop until I was miles away, deep in an unfamiliar part of the woods, far from Oakhaven, far from the quarry. I collapsed against an ancient tree, my body trembling, my mind overwhelmed by the torrent of information. The full weight of my discovery and my actions pressed down on me. I had unwittingly become an agent of chaos in an ancient, hidden world. I had poked a sleeping dragon, and it was now awake and aware of my presence. I had to be careful, more careful than ever before. They knew about me. They had seen everything. My cabin, my movements, my attempts to understand. They were watching. My options were dwindling. I couldn't go back to Oakhaven for direct observation. I couldn't risk the cabin, knowing they had seen my return there. I was out in the woods, exposed, running on dwindling supplies. I pulled out my GPS. I was far from any road, deep in the wilderness surrounding Oakhaven. I had to get back to civilization, to signal for help, to process this impossible truth. But I couldn't risk being followed. I couldn't risk leading them to other humans. A profound sense of isolation washed over me. I was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone, with a secret that could shatter humanity's understanding of its own existence. But amidst the fear, a new resolve hardened within me. They were watching. Good, let them watch. I would not be deterred. I was an anthropologist. I had seen their story, and now I would tell it. But first, I needed to survive. I spent the rest of the night walking, moving slowly and cautiously through the dense forest, guided by the stars. My backpack felt impossibly heavy, my legs ached with exhaustion, but I forced myself onward. I needed to find a way out of these woods, a way to reach help without alerting my unseen pursuers. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky with a fragile, hopeful light, I found myself on a small, overgrown logging trail, barely visible beneath a layer of fallen leaves. It wasn't much, but it was a path, a way out. I followed the trail, moving with renewed determination. The forest still felt watchful, but the open sky above offered a sliver of comfort. I knew this was just the beginning. The story wasn't over. It had just expanded into something far more ancient, far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. I walked for hours, the trail slowly widening, becoming more defined. I knew I was heading generally eastward, away from the deepest parts of the wilderness, towards where the more traveled roads might be. My mind was a constant loop of analysis and fear. The sheer scale of their existence, the millennia of their hidden observation, the intricate network of their energy system, it was almost too much to comprehend. And the fact that I had directly threatened their vital power source, their heart, made my situation profoundly dangerous. I kept a constant vigil, scanning the tree lines, listening for any unnatural sounds. I imagined their black eyes watching me from the shadows, their elongated forms phasing through solid rock, always just beyond my sight. My supplies were running critically low. I had only a few sips of water left and no food. My body was screaming for rest, but the adrenaline kept me going. I knew I couldn't stop until I was truly safe, or at least until I had a plan that didn't involve me being trapped and hunted in the wilderness. Late in the afternoon, after what felt like an eternity, the logging trail finally merged with a larger gravel road. It was still isolated, surrounded by dense forest, but it was a road, a sign of human presence, a faint hope. I followed the gravel road, my pace quickening, my heart lifting slightly. I didn't know where it led, but it had to lead somewhere, away from Oakhaven, away from the creatures. As I walked, I kept thinking about the projection at the quarry. Their story, their perspective. They weren't just monsters. They were an ancient, intelligent species fighting for their survival, hidden beneath a world that was oblivious to their existence. And I had stumbled into the middle of their delicate, hidden ecosystem and thrown a wrench into their ancient machinations. The chimes, the 3:17 a.m. ritual, it wasn't just a clock. It was their life pulse, their rhythm, their synchronization, and I had disrupted it. My understanding of Oakhaven, of the missing people, of the legends, was now complete and terrifying. The disappearances, were they acquisitions, resources for their damaged heart, or were they just collateral, a side effect of their secret existence, a means to maintain their anonymity? The thought made me sick to my stomach. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple, I heard it. In the distance, the faint, unmistakable hum of an engine. A car, a human vehicle, my heart leaped. Salvation. I broke into a run, stumbling, half falling, my legs burning with the last reserves of my strength. I ran towards the sound, desperate, tears stinging my eyes. The car, an old, dusty pickup truck, slowly rounded a bend in the gravel road. I waved my arms frantically, screaming, "Hey, hey!" My voice was raw and hoarse, but the sound carried on the still evening air. The truck slowed, its brakes squealing faintly. It was an old model, the paint faded, the bed piled high with what looked like logging equipment. The driver, a gruff-looking man with a weathered face and a thick, gray beard, peered out the window at me, his expression a mixture of surprise and suspicion. He was my lifeline, my only hope. I reached the truck, gasping for breath, my hands on my knees. "Please," I choked out, "I need a ride, I'm lost. I was doing research and I got separated from my group." It was a clumsy lie, but it was all I could manage. The man studied me, his eyes narrowed. He took in my appearance, my disheveled clothes, the wild look in my eyes. I probably looked like I'd just crawled out of a grave, or the asylum. Lost, huh? He rumbled, his voice gravelly. You look more like you ran from a bear. He didn't sound particularly convinced by my story. His gaze flickered to my backpack, then back to my face. Something like that, I managed, trying to steady my breathing. I need to get out of these woods, anywhere with people, a town. He grunted, his eyes still assessing me. Ain't much around here, lady, just logging roads and more trees, headin' east. Closest town's Waynesboro, 'bout an hour or so from here. That work for ya? Yes, that's perfect, I said, my voice cracking with relief. Thank you so much. He chewed on his lip for a moment, then sighed, a long, weary sound. All right, hop in, but you ain't tellin' me no tall tales about what you saw out there. I've heard enough of those. I nodded quickly, scrambling to open the passenger door. It creaked open, revealing a dusty interior, smelling faintly of diesel and stale coffee. I climbed in, my muscles protesting, and pulled the door shut. The man put the truck in gear, and we slowly started moving down the gravel road, away from the silent, watchful woods. The relief was immense, a physical weight lifting from my shoulders. But even as the truck rattled along, putting more distance between me and Oakhaven, the profound unease remained. I knew I wasn't truly safe. They had seen me. They knew. Name's Silas, the driver said, not looking at me. Silas Miller. Dr. Eris Thorne, I replied, then corrected myself. Just Eris, thank you again, Silas. He just grunted in response, his gaze fixed on the winding road ahead. He clearly wasn't interested in small talk, and I was too exhausted to initiate any. I leaned my head against the dusty window, watching the blur of trees, trying to make sense of the whirlwind in my mind. The quarry, the shimmering projection, the story of an ancient, hidden civilization, my accidental damage to their heart. It all felt like a dream, a hallucination born of sleep deprivation and terror. But the chilling certainty in my gut told me it was horrifyingly real. We drove in silence for what felt like an eternity. The sun dipped fully below the horizon and the sky turned a deep, inky blue. Silas turned on the headlights, their beams cutting through the deepening gloom. I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, a primal fear clutching at me, expecting to see a shimmering form or the glint of black, depthless eyes. Finally, after what Silas had promised was an hour, we saw the first faint lights of Waynesboro in the distance. A small, sleepy town, but to me, it looked like a beacon of hope. Silas pulled into the town, driving past a few scattered houses, a gas station, and a diner, before stopping outside a small, unassuming motel. "This here's the best I can do, ma'am," he said, turning off the engine. "Got a phone in there, hot water. You look like you could use both." "It's perfect, Silas," I said, tears pricking my eyes. "Thank you, truly. How much do I owe you?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Forget it. Just be more careful out there, Dr. Eris Thorne. Some things are best left alone." His gaze lingered on me for a moment, a hint of something unreadable in his weathered eyes before he shifted gears. "Well, good luck to ya." He drove off, leaving me standing alone in the dim light of the motel parking lot. I watched his tail lights disappear down the road, a profound sense of isolation washing over me once more. Silas, for all his gruffness, had been a crucial link back to the human world. Now I was truly on my own. I walked into the motel office, a small, brightly lit room that smelled of air freshener and old coffee. The clerk, a portly woman with a friendly smile, looked up from her magazine. Well, hello there, dearie. You look like you've been wrestling a badger. Her smile faltered slightly as she took in my appearance. I managed a weak smile. Something like that. Do you have a room available? She nodded, her eyes still scanning my muddy, torn clothes. Sure do, just one for the night. Yes, please. I filled out the form, my hand trembling slightly as I wrote my name. I paid with the last of my cash, barely enough for the room, and took the key. Room 7. The room was small, clean, and blessedly normal. A double bed, a small TV, a tiny bathroom. I collapsed onto the bed, the mattress surprisingly soft, and just lay there for a long moment, letting the silence and the normalcy wash over me. No humming, no chimes, just the faint hum of the air conditioning. But the images in my mind refused to fade. The pulsating heart, the enraged creatures, their ancient story. I couldn't rest. I forced myself up, went to the bathroom, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face was smudged with dirt, my hair a tangled mess, my eyes wide and bloodshot, dark circles beneath them. I looked utterly unhinged. This was the face of someone who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back. I turned on the shower, letting the hot water run, and then stepped in, letting the warmth slowly seep into my aching muscles. I scrubbed away the dirt and grime of the forest, but I knew I couldn't wash away the terror or the impossible truth I now carried. After a long, hot shower, I felt marginally human again. I put on the cleanest of my remaining clothes, a slightly less stained t-shirt and hiking pants, and then pulled out my backpack. I laid out my camera, my GPS, my notebook, and the small, smooth, dark stone from the well chamber on the motel room table. This was it, the evidence. I opened my notebook first, poring over my frantic sketches and notes. The intricate carvings, the description of the quarry's energy display, the chilling details of their history. It was all there, a testament to what I had witnessed. Then I looked at the camera. I had recorded the quarry projection. I had recorded my interactions with the well tablet. This was concrete, undeniable. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through the photos and videos, the clear images of the tablet's alien carvings, the video of my hand pressing the indentations, the faint light pulses, the final, distinct metallic clink, and then the footage from the quarry. The first few minutes were just dark, shaky video of the quarry walls, then the faint emerald glow. And then the explosion of light, the energy construct forming, the images flowing across the vast pit. The cosmos, Earth's interior, their subterranean cities, humanity's rise, Oakhaven's clock tower, the well, and finally the damaged crystalline heart, pulsing with red, and the enraged creatures pursuing me. It was all there, raw, unfiltered, the impossible truth captured on my camera. I watched the quarry video multiple times, my heart pounding with each replay. It was even more stunning, more terrifying than I remembered. This wasn't just a story, it was a cosmic revelation. My immediate thought was to contact Dr. Thorne. He was the one person I knew who might have the intellectual capacity, however reluctantly, to consider such a radical paradigm shift. He was a skeptical academic, yes, but he was also a brilliant one. He needed to see this. The world needed to see this. But then, the caution that Silas had warned me about, the primal fear that the creatures were still watching, resurfaced. Could I risk exposing this to the world so quickly? Could I risk leading them to other humans, to a wider population? They had shown me their rage, their ability to phase through rock, their resilience, their ancient intelligence. They were powerful, and they knew who I was. I closed the laptop, a heavy sigh escaping my lips. I couldn't just upload this to YouTube. I couldn't just send it to a random journalist. This required careful, strategic handling. This was a disclosure event of unimaginable proportions. I needed sleep. I needed to think clearly. I slipped the small, dark stone from the well back into my pocket. It felt like a tiny, humming secret, a direct link to their world. I locked the motel room door, pulled the curtains shut, and finally, exhausted, collapsed onto the bed. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and haunted by images of black eyes and glowing emerald energy. The next morning, I awoke with a jolt, the hum of the air conditioning briefly replaced by the imagined thrum of their network. For a terrifying second, I thought I was still in the well chamber. Then, the normalcy of the motel room returned, bringing a wave of relief. I felt marginally better, more rested, but the weight of my discovery was still immense. I needed to make contact. I needed help. I found my phone miraculously still charged and dialed Dr. Thorne's office number. It was early, but I hoped to catch him. It rang several times, then went to voicemail. You have reached the office of Dr. Julian Thorne. Please leave a message. I hesitated. How do you leave a voicemail explaining you've found a hidden alien civilization that lives inside the Earth and you've inadvertently damaged their power source? Dr. Thorne, it's Eris, I said, my voice tight with urgency. I've made some incredible discoveries in Oakhaven, far beyond what we discussed. It's urgent, critically urgent. I have evidence, physical evidence. I'm in Waynesboro at the Maple Leaf Motel, room 7. Please call me back as soon as you get this. It's a matter of global significance. I know that sounds dramatic, but you have to believe me, please. As I hung up, my heart pounding. It was a long shot. He'd probably think I was having a mental breakdown, but he was my only hope of a credible contact in the academic world. I knew I couldn't just sit there. I needed to eat, to get supplies, to plan my next move. I found a small diner a few blocks away, its faded sign advertising home cookin'. I ordered a massive breakfast, eating ravenously, trying to regain some of the energy I had lost. As I ate, I continued to process. The implications were mind-boggling. An ancient civilization hidden within our own planet, observing us for millennia. They weren't just extraterrestrial, they were terrestrial in a way no one could have imagined. What did they want? What were their long-term goals? Their observation of humanity, their subtle influence, for what purpose? And the disappearances, the missing people. I couldn't shake the chilling thought that they weren't just random. If their heart was damaged, if they needed resources, what better source than the unwitting humans living above their heads? The thought made me feel physically ill. After breakfast, I went to a small general store, buying more durable clothes, a new backpack, and enough non-perishable food and water for several days. I also bought a burner phone. If they were watching me, I didn't want them tracking my calls. Back in the motel room, I reviewed my evidence again. The photos, the videos, the notes. It was all so compelling, so irrefutable, but I knew how people reacted to the impossible. Disbelief, laughter, dismissal. I tried calling Dr. Thorne's office again every hour, leaving increasingly desperate messages. No reply. He was either away or ignoring my calls or perhaps already considered me unreliable. As the day wore on, a new unsettling feeling began to settle over me. A feeling of being watched, even here, miles away from Oak Haven. It was subtle, a prickling on the back of my neck, a fleeting shadow at the edge of my vision. Paranoia, or were they truly that effective? That evening, as dusk began to fall, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to get this information out. Even if Dr. Thorne wouldn't respond, there had to be another way. I checked out of the motel using a different name this time, paying in cash. I walked to the town's public library, a quaint building with dusty shelves and a few ancient computers. I needed a secure internet connection, not one that could be traced back to my new burner phone. I sat down at a computer, my heart hammering against my ribs. I inserted the memory card from my camera. I copied all the files, the high-resolution photos of the tablet, the video of my interactions, and most importantly, the quarry footage. Then I opened a new email, addressed to several prominent academic journals in anthropology, archaeology, and even physics. I drafted a concise, professional message, trying to convey the gravity of my discovery without sounding completely insane. I attached a small, low-resolution sample of the quarry video, explaining that higher-resolution files and further documentation were available upon request. I also included a more personal message to Dr. Thorne, detailing what I had found and urging him to review the attached files. I knew it was a long shot, but I had to try. I hovered over the send button, my finger trembling. This was it, the point of no return. I was exposing their existence. What would the consequences be for me, for humanity, for them? I took a deep breath and clicked send. A small window popped up. Email sent successfully. I leaned back in the chair, a strange mix of relief and dread washing over me. It was done. The secret was out, or at least on its way to being out. I quickly deleted the files from the computer, cleared the browsing history, and removed my memory card. I couldn't be too careful. As I walked out of the library, the evening air was cool and still. A sense of vulnerability, sharp and cold, settled over me. I had just declared war, in a way, on an ancient, hidden civilization, and I was alone. I decided I couldn't stay in Waynesboro. It was too close to Oak Haven. I needed to put more distance between myself and that place. I needed to get to a larger city, somewhere I could blend in, somewhere I could continue my work in relative safety, at least for now. I found the local bus station, a small, deserted building, and bought a ticket to the nearest major city, about a 4-hour ride away. I didn't care where, as long as it was far. As I sat on the bus, watching the darkness of the countryside roll by, my mind returned to the creatures. They had seen me send that email, hadn't they? If they could project their entire history, if they could track my every move in the wilderness, surely they could monitor human communications, especially one related to their hidden world. A new wave of fear, cold and profound, washed over me. I wasn't just in danger, I had just made the entire human race a potential target. I pulled out my burner phone, scrolling through my contacts. I had one other person I could potentially trust with this, someone outside of academia. My old friend Sarah. She was a journalist, a fiercely independent investigative reporter. She had a network, resources, and a healthy skepticism that was often paired with an open mind for the truly bizarre. If anyone could handle this story, it was her. I hesitated. Sarah was a friend, but this was beyond anything she had ever covered. This wasn't just a scoop, it was a societal earthquake. Could I put her and her career at such risk? But I couldn't do this alone. I needed an ally, someone who could help me navigate the media, the scientific community, and potentially the darker corners of government agencies that would inevitably get involved. I decided to wait, to contact her when I was truly safe, when I had a clearer picture of the immediate aftermath of my email. The bus arrived at the sprawling, bustling city just before midnight. I checked into another cheap motel using another fake name. The anonymity of the city was a small comfort, a vast ocean in which I hoped to disappear for a while. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and frantic research. I obsessively checked my email, waiting for a response from the academic journals, from Dr. Thorne. Nothing. Silence. The silence was almost worse than an outright dismissal. It suggested that either my emails were being ignored or, worse, intercepted. I spent hours in public libraries using different computers trying to find any obscure news reports, any academic papers that might hint at similar discoveries, anything that suggested I wasn't completely alone in this. Nothing. The world remained oblivious. The sense of isolation grew heavier. Had I imagined it all? Was I truly losing my mind? But then I would look at the photos, the videos, the small, dark stone in my pocket, and the impossible truth would reassert itself. I needed to be proactive. I couldn't just wait. I reached out to Sarah. I used my burner phone, calling her direct line, the one I knew she kept private. "Sarah, it's Aris." There was a moment of surprised silence on the other end. "Eris, my God, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for weeks. Your cabin's been empty. No one's heard from you. I was about to call the police." Her voice was a mix of relief and concern. "I know, I'm sorry," I said, my voice low and urgent. "I can't explain everything over the phone, but I need to see you. Immediately. I'm in the city. It's bigger than anything you've ever covered, Sarah. It's a story that will change everything." She paused, sensing the gravity in my tone. "Okay, Eris, you sound intense. What's going on? Are you in trouble?" "I am. We might both be. Just meet me tomorrow at the botanical gardens near the main fountain. Noon, no one else. And don't tell anyone you're meeting me. I mean it, Sarah. This is important." She hesitated again then. "All right, Eris. Noon, botanical gardens. You better have a hell of a story." "I do," I said, a grim certainty in my voice. "The biggest story in human history." I hung up, my heart pounding. Sarah was my last resort, my last hope for a credible way to get this information out. The next day, I arrived at the botanical gardens early, dressed in new, nondescript clothes, a wide-brimmed hat, and sunglasses. I found a secluded bench near the main fountain, from where I had a clear view of the entrance. My backpack, containing my precious evidence, was clutched tightly in my lap. Every person who walked by, every rustle in the bushes, sent a jolt of paranoia through me. I imagined black eyes watching from the shadows, their forms shimmering into existence. Precisely at noon, Sarah appeared. She looked worried, her brow furrowed, but her eyes held their usual sharp, intelligent glint. She was dressed in practical but stylish clothes, a large reporter's bag slung over her shoulder. She spotted me and walked directly towards me, her pace quick and purposeful. Eris, what the hell happened to you? You look like you've seen a ghost. I pulled her down onto the bench beside me, lowering my voice. Worse than a ghost, Sarah, much, much worse, and we don't have much time. I quickly, concisely began to tell her everything. I started with my initial research in Oak Haven, the legends, the strange sounds, the first encounter with the creature. I described the altar, the chimes, the open shaft, the first shriek, and the creature's rage. I showed her the photos of the tablet, explaining its function. Sarah listened intently, her expression shifting from skepticism to curiosity, then to a look of utter disbelief. She kept trying to interrupt, to ask questions, but I pressed on, urging her to listen to the whole story first. And then I continued, lowering my voice even further. I went to the quarry, and that's where I saw it all, their history, their purpose, everything. I pulled out my laptop, opening it quickly. You need to see this, Sarah. I clicked on the quarry video. The emerald light pulsing in the vast pit. The energy construct forming, the geometric patterns, the flowing images. The cosmos, the subterranean cities, humanity's rise, the constant hidden observation. And then the damaged crystalline heart pulsing with angry red and my own face interacting with their technology, causing the damage. Sarah watched, mesmerized, her jaw slowly dropping. Her initial skepticism had vanished, replaced by a look of profound shock and awe. Her eyes, usually so keen and critical, were wide with disbelief. As the video ended, the emerald light fading, the grinding sound of the blocks sealing the quarry resonating through the speakers, she just sat there, utterly silent. Finally, she slowly turned to me, her face pale. Eris, what in God's name is that? Her voice was a whisper. That, Sarah, I said, a grim satisfaction in my tone, is the biggest story in human history. An ancient, hidden, subterranean civilization living right beneath our feet, observing us for millennia. And I accidentally damaged their vital power source, their heart. She stared at me, then at the laptop screen, then back at me. Subterranean aliens living in the earth. Eris, are you serious? This isn't some elaborate hoax, some kind of mental break. I wish it were, Sarah. Believe me, I wish it were. I showed her the small, dark stone from the well. This is one of their components, and look. I pointed to the glowing veins. It's like the altar stone. She took the stone from me, her fingers tracing the faint, crystalline patterns. A shiver ran through her. This is cold, and it almost feels like it's humming. It's their technology, I confirmed. They phase through rock, they're resilient, and they're angry. They know I've damaged them, and they've been watching me ever since. Her eyes widened further. Watching you, how, like physically watching? They showed me in the projection, my cabin, my movements, my attempts to understand. They saw me send those emails, Sarah. They know I'm trying to tell the world. She looked around the busy gardens, a new, dawning fear in her eyes. So we're not safe here. Nowhere is truly safe, Sarah, I said, but the city offers anonymity for now. We need to move quickly. You're a journalist, you have contacts, you know how to vet a story. We need to get this out properly before they stop us. She took a deep, shaky breath, her journalistic instincts kicking in even amidst the shock. Okay, Okay, this is monumental. This is beyond anything. Pulitzer Prize, Nobel Prize, maybe even a new category of prize. But it's also completely insane. No one will believe us without ironclad proof. I have the proof, Sarah. This video, these photos, my notes, my personal testimony, it's all there. They'll say it's CGI, a prank, a sophisticated hoax, she argued, already thinking like a reporter. We need more than just a video, we need a physical sample, something verifiable, something that scientists can analyze and confirm is not from this earth, or at least not conventionally explainable. I held up the dark stone. This is a physical sample. It's not just rock. It's part of their system. Yes, but you found it in a well, she countered. How do we prove it's connected to subterranean aliens and not just some unusual geological formation or an elaborate art piece someone dropped down there? She had a point. The video was compelling, but the scientific community would tear it apart, looking for any possible explanation other than the impossible. We need to go back, she said, her voice firming with resolve. Not to Oakhaven itself, but to the general area. We need to find another artifact. Something undeniably alien, something that can't be dismissed as a hoax or misinterpretation. A piece of their technology. My blood ran cold. Go back, Sarah, that's incredibly dangerous. They know I'm a threat. They're enraged. They sealed off the quarry. They'll be watching. Exactly, she said, her reporter's mind already strategizing. They sealed off the quarry because it's their power source. What about other nodes? The well, for example. Did you get anything else from the well or the altar? I shook my head. Just the tablet and the altar in the clock tower. I managed to collect this stone from the surface earlier, just thinking it was an interesting rock. If I had known, I would have taken more. The problem is they are incredibly resilient. My utility knife barely scratched them. Their technology is solid stone and their creatures phase through matter. Then we need to be smarter, she said, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous determination. We don't go into Oakhaven directly. We observe. We find a new access point or something they drop or a discarded piece of their tech. Something small, something we can get out without alerting them to our presence. It's too risky, Sarah, I insisted. They'll be expecting me, they'll sense us. And what's the alternative, Aris? She challenged. Just hope those emails get through. Hope anyone, believes you based on a shaky video. No, this story is too big, too important. Humanity needs to know, and if it means taking a calculated risk, then we take it. Her conviction was infectious, almost reckless, but she was right. Without verifiable physical proof, my story was just the ramblings of a traumatized academic. Okay, I conceded, a fresh wave of dread washing over me, but also a flicker of renewed purpose. But we go in prepared, meticulously prepared. We don't engage, we observe, and we try to extract a sample without them knowing. Exactly, she said, a small, grim smile touching her lips. This is what I do. I uncover secrets. You found the biggest secret in the universe. Now let's expose it. We spent the rest of the day in a secluded corner of the gardens, planning. Sarah's investigative background was invaluable. She thought of angles I hadn't considered. Silent drones for observation, thermal imaging, ground-penetrating radar, even specialized tools for discrete sample collection. We'll need to secure funding, she said. This isn't a cheap expedition, and we'll need absolute discretion. no one can know what we're really looking for." "Who would believe us?" I countered. "The moment we mention subterranean aliens, we'll be laughed out of any funding meeting." "We don't tell them everything," she said, a mischievous glint in her eye. "We pitch it as an archaeological survey of the Oakhaven ruins with an emphasis on unusual geological formations and seismic anomalies. We can even hint at a lost, ancient human civilization to pique interest. Then, once we have funding and equipment, we go after the real target." It was a brilliant, if ethically questionable, plan, but the stakes were too high for conventional ethics. "We'll need a cover story for you," she continued. "You're a renowned anthropologist, but you're also the direct target. We need to keep you off their immediate radar. You'll be the scientific consultant from afar, analyzing data. I'll be the lead investigator on the ground." "No," I said firmly. "I'm going with you. I know their patterns, their network. I know what to look for, and if they show up, I'm the one who might understand what they're doing." Sarah looked at me, a flicker of concern in her eyes, but she saw the fierce determination in mine. "All right, Eris, but we stick to my rules. Safety first, no heroics. And if I say pull out, we pull out, no questions asked." "Agreed," I said, a shiver running down my spine. The thought of returning to Oakhaven, of facing those creatures again, filled me with dread. But the alternative, letting this monumental truth remain hidden, was unbearable. We spent the next week working tirelessly. Sarah, leveraging her contacts and reputation, managed to secure limited funding from an independent research foundation, pitched as an unusual archaeological and geological anomaly study in the Oakhaven region. She exaggerated the potential for discovering a previously unknown ancient human settlement, enough to get their attention without delving into the impossible. We acquired the necessary equipment, high-resolution cameras, an advanced drone with thermal and night vision capabilities, ground-penetrating radar GPR that could map subterranean structures, and discrete digging tools. We also focused on personal safety, rugged outdoor gear, first aid kits, and communication devices. I spent hours briefing Sarah, going over every detail of my encounters, every observation, every theory. I showed her my detailed maps of Oakhaven, outlining the clock tower, the well, the quarry, and the faint, almost erased lines that now clearly marked their subterranean network. "The chimes are the key," I explained. 3:17 a.m., that's when they activate. That's when we'll have our best chance to observe and potentially to extract a sample. Sarah absorbed everything, her mind rapidly synthesizing the information. "So, we're looking for an active node, somewhere peripheral where a creature might interact with an artifact, or where a component might be exposed." "Exactly," I confirmed. "We can't go near the clock tower or the quarry again. Too obvious, too dangerous. We need to find something new, maybe one of the smaller anomalies on the old maps. A smaller well, a fissure, anything that might be part of their extended network." We pored over geological maps of the region, identifying other potential points of interest, small sinkholes, cave entrances, or abandoned mine shafts that might offer discreet access. One particular spot caught my eye. An old, disused mine shaft marked on a very old map located several miles east of Oakhaven, deep within the forest. It was an exploratory shaft from the late 19th century, abandoned after no significant mineral deposits were found. It was far enough from Oakhaven to be relatively safe, but close enough that it might tap into the extended subterranean network. This could be it, I said, pointing to the map. An abandoned mine. It's already an existing penetration into the Earth. If their network extends this far, it could be a discrete access point or even a smaller node they use. Sarah nodded, her eyes gleaming. Perfect. Less likely to be actively monitored since it's disused. We can approach it cautiously, use the GPR to see if there's any unusual subterranean activity, and then deploy the drone. As the day for our return trip approached, a new kind of tension settled over me. It wasn't just fear now, but a grim determination. I had a clear goal: to expose the truth, and I had an ally, someone who believed me, someone who was willing to risk everything. We packed our gear into a rented, nondescript SUV. Sarah insisted we avoid any direct routes from the city to Oakhaven, taking circuitous back roads, changing vehicles once just in case. Her paranoia, a journalist's learned caution, was proving invaluable. Finally, late one afternoon, we arrived back in the vicinity of the Oakhaven woods. We parked the SUV several miles from the old mine shaft, deep in a secluded thicket, hidden from any potential aerial or ground surveillance. From here, we go on foot, Sarah said, checking her gear. Silent approach, no lights unless absolutely necessary. We set up our observation post, deploy the GPR and drone, and wait for 3:17 a.m. The familiar dread returned as we stepped back into the ancient forest. The air felt heavy, the silence profound. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed amplified, imbued with a sinister intent. We moved slowly, stealthily, making our way towards the coordinates of the old mine shaft. The terrain was rough, overgrown, making progress difficult. The sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of purple and orange, but offering little warmth or comfort. As darkness settled, the forest grew truly alive, but not with familiar animal sounds. There was an unnerving quiet, a sense of being watched, of something ancient and powerful stirring beneath the earth. After what felt like hours, we reached the location of the mine shaft. It was exactly as described on the map, an overgrown, collapsed entrance. A barely discernible depression in the earth, framed by ancient, moss-covered stones and tangled roots. The shaft itself was mostly filled with debris, fallen trees, boulders, and layers of earth, making direct entry impossible without heavy equipment. But it was there, a scar on the land, a testament to human curiosity and eventual abandonment. "This is it," I whispered, pointing to the jumbled mass of earth and rock. "The old Blackwood mine shaft, abandoned since the 1890s. Sarah nodded, pulling out a tablet. "Coordinates match. Okay, Eris, let's get our perimeter established. We need to be invisible." We moved deeper into the undergrowth, finding a natural hollow about 50 yards from the shaft, concealed by a thick cluster of hemlocks and overgrown rhododendrons. This would be our temporary base, an observation post from which to deploy our equipment. First, we set up our portable ground-penetrating radar GPR system. It was a compact unit, but powerful enough to give us a detailed subsurface map of the immediate area. Sarah carefully calibrated it, sweeping the transducer over the ground towards the mine shaft. I watched the screen intently, a faint green grid appearing, representing the layers of earth and rock beneath us. "Okay," Sarah murmured, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Standard geological strata, lots of bedrock weight." Her finger traced a line on the screen. A distinct anomaly was appearing deep beneath the mine shaft. It wasn't a natural geological formation. It was too regular, too structured. "What is it?" I breathed, leaning closer. "Looks like a chamber," she replied, her voice tinged with awe. "Or a tunnel, definitely not natural, and it's pulsating." The green lines on the GPR screen representing the anomaly were subtly, rhythmically expanding and contracting, a slow, almost imperceptible beat. It was the thrumming, the subterranean thrumming I had felt in Oakhaven, now visually confirmed. My heart hammered against my ribs. "It's their network, Sarah, extending this far out. It's active." "Okay," she said, her voice firming. "This is promising, very promising, now for the drone." She unpacked the advanced drone, a sleek, silent model with an array of sensors, thermal, night vision, and even a limited spectrum analyzer. She launched it with practiced ease, sending it hovering silently above the mine shaft, its tiny rotors barely audible over the whisper of the wind. The drone's live feed appeared on a separate tablet. We switched to night vision, watching the ghostly green landscape unfold. The mine shaft entrance, the surrounding trees, the distant, silent forest. "I'm going to send it down the shaft as far as it can go," Sarah explained. "If there's an opening or a hidden passage, it might detect it." She maneuvered the drone with delicate precision, guiding it into the collapsed shaft. It encountered resistance, debris, but slowly, meticulously, it navigated deeper. The camera feed became shaky, dust motes dancing in the drone's tiny spotlight. Then a clear image, a narrow fissure almost perfectly round, opening vertically from the floor of the shaft, too small for a human to enter but large enough for the drone. It descended into the darkness. The GPR screen, meanwhile, showed the pulsating anomaly directly beneath that fissure. It was definitely a connection. The drone continued its descent. The air grew colder, the visual feed occasionally glitching with interference. And then we saw it. Deep below, at the end of the fissure, a small, circular chamber. It was roughly carved, but at its center sat a pedestal of the same dark, smooth stone I had seen in Oakhaven. On the pedestal, a faint, almost imperceptible emerald light pulsed, radiating from a small, crystalline object embedded within the stone. "Another altar," I whispered, a shiver running through me. "A smaller node, just as I suspected." "And it's active," Sarah added, zooming in on the drone's camera. "That crystal, it's glowing." The drone's thermal camera showed a distinct heat signature emanating from the crystal, even at that depth. The spectrum analyzer, meanwhile, picked up subtle energy readings, consistent with the patterns I had described from the quarry. "This is it, Sarah," I said, my voice thick with a mix of fear and triumph. "This is the verifiable artifact. This is a piece of their living technology. If we